We're recording.
We're recording? Okay. Good evening. This is the Town of New Canaan Affordable Housing Committee regular meeting, Monday, May 13, 2024. Let's take attendance. John Goodwin, I'm here. Chris Wilson.
Here.
Krista Nielsen.
Here.
Bill Perrette.
Here.
Maria Weingarten.
Here.
Jane Williams.
Here.
Hillary Orman.
Here.
Mike Sweeney.
Here.
And Jeff Williams should be on Zoom.
Present.
Great. Okay, super. Okay, item number 2, minutes, approval of minutes, meeting held on April 15, 2024. Do I have a motion for approval?
So moved.
Mr.
Second.
Wilson moved. Who seconded? Mr. Perrette? Okay, super. All those in favor? Great. Okay, thank you. At this time, I would like to entertain a motion to amend the agenda to have Tom O'Day speak to us about Housing Bill 5474. Do I have a motion to amend the agenda?
So moved.
Jane, was that Jane? Okay, second?
Second?
Okay, great. We're amended. So Representative O'Day, when I played baseball, I was not very good at hitting a curveball, but this was quite the curveball, but this was a good curveball. So tell us all about it, please.
Thank you very much for having me. Sorry, I'm not there in person. I got held up in the office, but as many of you know, I have been working with Ryan Fazio and our other local reps, including Lucy Dathan, Keith Denning, and Cece Marr, and trying to get some amendments to 830G. And meeting with the governor in New Canaan and meeting with the majority leader, Jason Rojas, I drove him around New Canaan, and we have been meeting with them over the course of the year. And both myself and I know Maria testified, a number of us have testified on amendments to 830G. And the obviously the 10% threshold to get to for municipalities other than bigger cities. It's very difficult. We couldn't get that amended. However, in looking at the general statute 830G subsection 3, I should say L3, what I had testified to in Hartford this year was to amend that. It currently reads, for moratorium purposes, eligible units completed after a moratorium has begun may be counted toward establishing eligibility for a subsequent moratorium. Now, as you all know, the town has been involved in litigation because we built more units than needed for the last moratorium. And it has always been our belief that the intent of the legislation was that if you built more, it should be counted towards your next moratorium. And so during this earlier part of the session, there was a hearing. I testified that section should be amended. And I put an amendment on that House Bill 5474, a number of amendments, including the amendment to section 3 that specifically states that units built in addition to the units necessary for moratorium would be carried over. And I also was able to get the chair of the housing committee, movement of it, or the planning and development committee, and Jason Rojas to agree for legislative intent purposes that towns in the past that had built units that exceeded the numbers needed for moratorium, those units would be counted towards the next moratorium. So, and the effective date of passage, I asked them to change it from October of 2024 to upon passage. Now, the governor, I don't think signed it today. He signed a number of bills, but I anticipate him signing this fairly soon, if not today, so that that language change will be effective upon passage. So, and in my discussions on the floor of the House, as far as intent, I made it clear that I believed, and I got the chair of the housing or the planning and development committee to testify or to state on the floor of the House on the record that this section 3 has always had the intent to encourage towns to build more units and that they should be counted towards a moratorium. So I believe our council has communicated. I have not communicated with our council, but I believe that that council for the town has communicated with someone from the town that they believe that my understanding of the intent and my understanding of the new language is consistent with his, and that the town now can utilize those units that were previously built and count towards the next moratorium. So I think I sent a brief summary to Maria that I certainly can forward around, stating that, this should, and I believe will, count towards our next moratorium, and it should be granted and will be granted. My understanding is the commissioner for the housing had consented to this amendment and agrees with it. So I think we're good.
Questions for Representative O'Day?
I would just add 2 points to that, just to make sure if someone's reporting on this, we get it factually correct. So it should be noted that Brookfield applied for and received a moratorium in June of 2022. And they used holdover, what I'm calling holdover points is what we're talking about here. We applied for our moratorium July of 2022, so 1 month later. And by October 2022, we were denied on the usage of holdover points. So it was moving the goalpost, changing a methodology. So that's for first thing. The second thing that's worth noting is that when the letter of approval came for our first moratorium, in that actual letter, it says, congratulations on your first moratorium. And then it says you have X number of units that you can use to your next moratorium. So those are important points that I think, it should be out there in the ether and everyone should understand that as well.
Great.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Tom, how do you expect this to impact, if at all, our current application for a moratorium and the litigation we have? Will it obviate the need for the litigation to continue on this issue? Or is it just effective as of the passage date, which means going forward, we could use the holdover units we're not currently using for our next, when you say our next moratorium, do you mean not this one, but the one in 4 years?
No, I think that, I'm sorry, is that Hillary? I
Yes.
couldn't. See it.
Oh, I'm over here. Sorry, Tom, I didn't realize I wasn't on the screen. Yes, that was me.
Yes, so Hillary, yeah, that's a very good question, and that's why I made it clear on the floor of the House. So for those non-lawyers, generally where there's ambiguity in a statute, judges look towards legislative language and the comments on the floor to get legislative intent.
Mhm.
And so before the bill was brought to the floor, I confirmed for legislative intent that we were all on the same page, that this would apply retroactively
Oh.
to units that were built in the past towards future moratoriums. Now, we couldn't get that language put actually in the statute, but we got, for legislative intent purposes, I asked the question on the floor to the movement of the bill, the chair of the Planning and Development Committee, that for legislative intent purposes, would housing units built previously that didn't count towards a moratorium count prospectively towards the next moratorium? And the answer to that was yes.
Okay.
So in my understanding is that the litigation, both from the perspective of the state and from the perspective of the town, is essentially moot at this point.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know what needs to be put on the record or what conversations or what needs to be done between the parties to confirm that. But my understanding is that this legislation, this amendment that we got passed, and the legislative intent that we articulated on the floor of the House, I did with the chair, means that the litigation is no longer needed for determining the outcome.
Fantastic. Thanks for your work on this. And I appreciate everybody's hard work on it. I think this is an excellent step forward. So thank you.
And, well, any other questions for Tom?
I just have a quick comment. So thanks to Tom and all the local reps for doing this. For our purposes of our committee, I think It's a critical change. We were faced with a unknown timeline on a lawsuit with fairly significant impact on how it affected the next moratorium. So the clarity is going to be hugely helpful for us in figuring out projects. So thanks, Tom.
No, my pleasure. And to be clear, I was quoted in the press. I don't know if when I was interviewed by the press, or rather, they were trying to say that New Canaan doesn't want any affordable housing, and that's why we want the moratorium. And as I was pointing out, that's not accurate. We were one of the first towns to actually have the building permit fee that Laszlo Papp shepherded through. And that, because land is so expensive and we don't get a whole lot of state aid, in order for us to buy property and properly plan, it takes time. And so the moratorium time period is needed for us to not only raise the money and save the money, but also plan where it's most appropriate. So, I'm very glad that you all have volunteered to be in where you are, and very appreciative of that. And I'm happy to work in any way possible. My two highest priorities for the last session were, the 830G fix with local control and making sure the fiscal guardrail stayed in place. We didn't fix 830G completely, but we fixed it a little bit. And obviously we look forward to working with you all to the next fix. I greatly appreciate all your work. So thank you.
Thank you,
Good job,
Tom.
Tom. Thank you.
And I think when we get to the project committee tonight, I think we need to have discussion and sort of talk about what some of the implications are. Also, for the record, I did ask Attorney Bamonte, who's of counsel to the town, to speak to us tonight. He had a conflict. He also wanted to be a little more conservative and wait for the governor to sign. But Tom, in terms of my conversation with him, pretty much what you said is what he's thinking. So.
And this was the majority leader, Jason Rojas's, this was his priority. So I am extremely confident the governor will be signing this. But yes, I mean, obviously it's not 100% yet until he's actually signed it. But and I promised the majority leader and the speaker that I would be continue to work with them towards fixes to 830G. As everyone admits, it hasn't worked in particularly Lower Fairfield County. So I'm going to be listening to you all and working with you to see what fixes would be most appropriate for New Canaan. So thank you again. And I look forward to talking to you as time goes on.
Great. Thank you again, Tom. Have a good evening.
Maria, would you mind circulating what Tom sent you
Yes.
to us? Thank you.
Great. Okay, let's get back on track. So we'll get into the education part of the evening. We'll start with a discussion with Melissa Kaplan-Macy from the Fairfield County Center for Housing
And excuse me,
Opportunity.
just make sure you speak more directly into the microphone, please.
Geez, Bob, am I being that bad? Yeah, okay.
No, you can bring it towards you if you want to.
Yeah.
And make sure the green light.
Yeah, push the.
There you go.
Okay, we good?
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So Melissa, thank you for coming. I think Jane briefed you on where we're going. I know you've read my article, and so we welcome your remarks.
Great, thank you. And so I have my slide deck, which I won't be able to see, so I'm going to cheat a little and read my notes.
Sure.
But I just wanted to start and say thank you for inviting me to be here and to share some thoughts and be part of the conversation. I'll say this is a slide deck I had actually modified a bunch for this meeting, but something I've been talking to municipal officials about in Westchester County, other parts of Connecticut. So I just appreciate the opportunity to talk about it with you today. But please stop me if anything, that I'm saying you want to have a little bit of a back and forth. It's really meant to be informational and educational, for me as well as for you all in the work that I'm doing. So thank you. So I'll just start with a little introduction, who I am. So first slide. Okay. All right. Well, I don't need the slides to introduce myself, so I will just start with Melissa Kaplan-Macy. I'm the Chief Initiative Officer at the Housing Collective, leading the Centers for Housing Opportunity. We work regionally in the state of Connecticut in 3 regions: in Fairfield County, thank you, next slide, Litchfield County, and out in Eastern Connecticut. And I've spent my whole career as an urban planner. Affordable housing has been my area of interest through most of my career. Sorry, next slide. Thank you. I'm really excited to be leading the work in Fairfield County with my collective impact partners. You can see at the bottom of the screen, we take a collective approach. The idea is that there are a lot of folks working on this issue in Connecticut, and working together, we can all play to our individual organizational strengths. So things like aligning our resources, leveraging partnerships, working with folks to build capacity around policy and planning. And I'm really excited to be in the lead on that work. I come to this work from the Regional Plan Association, which I think most of you have heard of at this point. We also at RPA really spend a lot of time focusing on affordable housing. I was there for 8 years, and I just joined the Housing Collective about 6 months ago. And one of the honestly proudest planning moments of my career was being part of writing the 4th Regional Plan. And the parts that I really focused in on were about making the region affordable for everyone. So RPA looks at the whole tri-state metropolitan region, so New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. My work at RPA was focused in Connecticut. I was the Connecticut director there. And the way we developed that recommendation was actually really getting on the ground in communities across the whole region and working with community-based partners to help us really understand what the issues were, and we put those recommendations out in a plan, which is all, well and good, but it's a long range 25-year plan for a tri-state metropolitan region. And really the decisions and the way that actually works, as you all know, is what happens in municipalities on the ground. So working on actually getting this work moved forward is really all about these kind of conversations, which was why I was excited to be invited here today. And it really is, just a great opportunity to think about how to do this, in the context in which we operate. I read John's op-ed. I really loved it, honestly, and I don't say that lightly. Just taking, looking at what the landscape is, not necessarily debating whether we want to do something or we don't want to, we like it or it's political or it's not, but really just saying, okay, here's the landscape and here's a solution, and we're going to work on it together to figure out what works best for our community, which I think is a fantastic approach, personally. So next slide. And I'll just share, I'm very, very, very passionate about this topic. So in my spare time, when I'm not doing this work at my day job, I also am a really active, passionate local volunteer in my own community. I live in Westchester County in the town of Mamaroneck. I'm on the Mamaroneck Housing Authority Board. I volunteer with the steering committee for the comprehensive plan. I volunteer with our local affordable housing coalition because I really feel strongly that, all of us, and I assume, all of you as well, when you spend time thinking about this and working on it, then giving back in your local community and being part of the conversation is really important. And those are my kids. Obviously, I really care about the future of my community and my kids and what that looks like for all of us. So just a little context, I'm not just coming here saying, I know so much about affordable housing. I spent my career as a planner, but really I am very passionate about, the volunteer aspect of this and how hard it is. Like, it's extra time that you spend on top of your day job and everything else with your families, and that being here is a commitment because you care. So that's kind of the place we're all coming from when we do this work together. Next slide. Okay, so this is kind of my favorite slide. I developed it not for this meeting actually, but for other meetings, but I tailored it a little bit to you guys. So when I think about why I'm so passionate about affordable housing and why I even care at all, it does come back to this concept for me about what makes a community, a thriving community, a place I want to live, a place I want my kids to live. And I don't know if you all remember the Who Are the People in Your Neighborhood sketch from Sesame Street. For some reason, that song is burned in my brain forever, but it's all the people in our neighborhoods, right? And so when we're thinking about affordable housing, if we can think about it as people, not as units, and think about, what do we mean when we say 30% area median income? We mean the barista at Starbucks, right? What do we mean when we say 80%? We mean the teachers in our schools. And then, I don't know if you can see it because it's a little bit small, but then if you break that down, and this is probably more for the audience than for all of you, but what does that really mean in terms of what you could afford? The rent, if you're a barista at Starbucks and you're at 30% of AMI in New Canaan, is little over $1,000 a month is what you can afford to pay. And we all know that that's just not a housing option that exists here, right? If you're a teacher, it's a little over $2,000 a month. So if we're thinking about the places we want to have for our families, for our community, they really are places that have room for all of us. So that's really why I'm so passionate about it. Next slide. Actually, I guess I can see up there. So the other thing too is, it's about workforce, of course. It's also about older people, who've been part of this community forever, raised their kids here, spent their lives here. And it's really about housing choices. If we only have, single family homes, there just aren't places to go to downsize to. And so then you have to leave And it means also, on the other end of the spectrum, young people who grew up here can't afford to be here. Your grandkids move to California. If we don't have housing choices for more people across ages and incomes, it's a very narrow band of folks who can afford to live in the town. Next slide. And we're not alone. I just did a very quick Google search and, national headlines across the whole country. There's a housing crisis, as it were. There's just not enough different types of homes. There's not enough affordable homes all over the place. So it's not just, New Canaan, as you all know, or Connecticut that's grappling with this. We're all grappling with this. So, I think that's important context. It feels very personal, because we're getting down to the local level. That's where the decisions are made, but it really is this bigger picture that we're all part of. Next slide. And this is a map you've probably seen, and I'm not telling you anything you don't already know. But again, just to emphasize the point that if we only have single family housing in certain communities, it means that we just only have one choice. So that's going to be single family. It's going to be more expensive. It's not necessarily going to meet people at different ages, stages of life, incomes. And I think, just level setting on that and just, kind of agreeing and then moving forward, which is what you're all doing with this work, I think is important. Next slide. And again, I just want to restate, we're not alone. People are looking at zoning across the whole entire country, and Connecticut, being the first, which I'm pretty proud of actually, that taking a real look at all the zoning codes across the whole state of Connecticut and breaking it down to understand, because you can't really solve for a problem if you don't know what it is. So just having that data as a source is important. Next slide. Okay, but so this is the good part of the presentation that I really like, because I think this is the hopeful part, right? And it's the story that we want to tell. And it's not the story we have told, which is it's not a zero-sum game. Creating more affordable housing doesn't mean that we're not going to have a community that we love, right? It really is a different way of coming into this. We can have both and. You can have great schools, you can have a great quality of life, really easy access to New York City, and you can have great housing choices for people at the same time. And so in the work that you're all doing, a big part of this is the narrative. It's the conversations you're having, with people in the community. And if we can start to have a different conversation, I think we can see a different result. Next slide. Okay, so this is an important point. I'm sorry, I can't see that far, so I will look at my notes just so I can remember the points that I had emphasized. But the point really want to make is there's no silver bullet. As you know, there's not one thing that's going to work for everyone. There's not one thing that's going to solve all of it, right? We need more housing across Connecticut. We need more housing across the country. And no community has to do everything, but every community has to do something, right? Because it's a national problem, a national crisis. And unlike other infrastructure, right, the housing is solved at the local level. As you all, rightly point out, it's locally controlled. And so the decisions are made at home. And so if at home we're not contributing to the solutions, we're not going to be able to solve this. So again, being proactive as you are, I think is really critical. And just, you can read, I won't read all the bullets, but what you've all been talking about, we need appropriately scaled development, things that make sense on sites that make sense. And that just means doing the hard work that you're doing, selecting sites, looking at it, talking to neighbors, figuring it out so that you come up with the solutions that really do work for you. Next slide. Okay, so this one, as I said, I had prepared for a previous presentation, and when I read it again and was thinking about this presentation, I thought, you know what, this is great because you've already checked the first two boxes or the first one and you're moving on to the second one, but it's really about doing the work and planning ahead, because you all know when a project gets delivered to a neighborhood and here it is, I mean, it all blows up every single time. Like, we always know it's the parking, it's the school children, it's the traffic. My sister called me from Boston a couple weeks ago. I was in the supermarket. She's like, oh my God, she lives outside of Boston in Milton. We have this affordable housing development and everybody's all upset. And I said, well, is it the parking and the school children and the traffic? She said, yes, how did you know? I was like, well, because it always is the same thing, right? But the point is, we need to figure it out. So we plan for it. We have those conversations where we figure out how to build the local support, which I'll talk about a little bit more in detail, because that's the hardest part, right? Like, you can decide there's a challenge, you can figure out what you think the solutions are, but if you're not able to bring the community with you through the process along the way, it's going to end up the same way every time. We know this at this point, right? So that's really the critical piece, is building that local support and doing what you're doing through these types of, just have the conversation, get everybody involved. Don't just sort of deliver something and say, hey, do you like this? Of course you don't, right? So, and then identifying the sites. You have to be specific. It's, I think we're now at the point where most communities are saying, yes, we need affordable housing. Okay, where are you going to put it? Well, not in my backyard, not over there, not, we have to be able to identify sites, as you all know. And then, to zone for it, so then you can tell the market what you want. So if you are identifying the sites yourself, you're zoning it the way you want it developed, then that's what you'll get, right? Instead of responding to something that comes at you. I mean, we're talking about 830G, that's the other option, really, right? Is to react to something that comes to you versus being the ones to zone for what you want to see in your community. And I'll say specifically, John, just identifying, I was so excited in your op-ed, 70 to 100 units in 4 to 5 years. Like, there's a goal, right? Great. Then you know what you're working towards and you can solve a problem if you have,
Unfortunately, we just learned tonight the goal changed. but-
well, whatever the goalposts are, and they're always moving, but I think just being specific, right? Like just saying, look, here's where we're at. You can tell the whole community, this is what we're doing with you, not for you. Join us. This is how we're going to solve it. That's the way to do it. I mean, I'll be honest, pleasantly surprised when I dug in a little bit, when I was invited, to join you all tonight, to see that I think you're doing all the right things. You know what I mean? Not just saying that because I'm sitting in front of you tonight and it sounds good on, whatever TV, but I really think that's true. Next slide. So this is the part, right? Plan for it and build the local support and doing the hard work, right? Having all the community meetings that you need to have, but also the smaller neighborhood scale meetings, figuring out how to deal with social media in a way that's productive, because it's out there and it's going to show up on Nextdoor whether we like it or not. So, really digging in and deciding kind of what your strategy is for building support. And obviously it's those conversations at the grocery store and, at the PTA and all those places where you all are. Next slide. And this is another piece that's more on the mechanics, which I think other folks will get into, so I won't spend too much time, but it's just make it predictable for everyone, right? So not everybody's guessing all the time and feeling uncomfortable and feeling, like you said, the goalposts are always moving. So zone for it, like I said earlier, you know what the options are, right? There's different ways in, there's transit-oriented development, there's, for you guys, probably less so on the strip commercial, you don't have, many strip commercial areas, but, looking at some 2-family, 4-family, which I know you also have a good head start at. Looking at your parking minimums, looking at your lot sizes, where can you fine tune your zoning so that you can get what you're looking for? And then the other place is really streamlining the process, right? So when folks are coming to you, to your boards, they know exactly what to expect and how long it's going to take. One of my, I don't know, this is completely, bears out in the research, but in my opinion, the amount of time that architects and developers spend going back and doing drawings over and over and over again, just you end up with a project that doesn't look as good as because the budget is the budget, right? I mean, there's some room there, but every time you come back to another meeting and you're paying the lawyers and you're redoing the plans, you're value engineering down your project and you're not getting the best project. So if you can get the process clear and you can explain, to yourselves, to your community members, to the developers, and that this is the process and I'll move through it together, then everybody gets to a better place more quickly and not just efficiently, but you get a better product in the end. Next slide. So this is a little more kind of context piece. I feel like it's important to talk about there's a lot of conversation, right, about housing, and there's we just need more, which we do because we don't have enough. And part of, the crisis that we have is that we're just so undersupplied, which at the county level or at the state level, like that is the big picture. And there's, a recent study Pew Research put out about New Rochelle. They've, over the border in New York, they've built a lot of housing and it has actually stabilized rents. Like there is a point at which that happens. But when we're talking about small towns like New Canaan, really focusing as you are on the affordable units from my perspective and from my, place at the Housing Collective and with the Fairfield County Center, I think that's the right place to be because the amount you'd have to create to stay, to change the market here, focusing on the affordable, I think makes a lot of sense. And you're already, doing a few things on my checklist. You've got an affordable housing trust fund, you have inclusionary zoning, and then other things to look at. Do you have any publicly owned property you can leverage? To the point earlier about the cost of land. Is there some thinking around how you maintain long-term affordability? Thinking about things like a community, land trust, land bank, for example, density bonuses, and how do you, and as I said earlier, you can just reduce the cost by making the process more predictable for everybody, because really getting the numbers to work is also a big challenge here with the cost of land that we have in Fairfield County. Next slide. So we're all in this together. That's, I mean that we are, I think it's a contentious issue and it feels very politicized, but it's not a Democrat or Republican issue. We all need homes. We need homes for our parents. We need homes for our kids. We need homes for ourselves. So we really all are in this together, and you're doing all the things, like I had said on my checklist, just really sharing opportunities and challenges with other communities, tapping into experts. And I literally did not make this list for you all. This was just my list. And, I think figure out what's working, what's not working. And yeah, what do you need from the county and the state? And celebrate your victories. I was pretty excited. I actually spoke with Jeff on the phone the other day, just, relatedly from the Community Foundation. And he mentioned Canaan Parish. And I looked it up. I was like, this is terrific. You've done it. You know how to do this. This looks great. I like to tell the story over the line in New York and Harrison. I was at a meeting last fall with Governor Hochul, and she had asked a bunch of local communities to come together to talk about affordable housing, and the mayor of Harrison is just sitting right next to her, and he says, well, I didn't think I was gonna like it, but I like it. It's just like that. It is actually, when done right, it's great, and we can all be really proud of it. So that's sort of in summary. I have one last slide, which is just next slide, please, to say in my work at the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity, here to help, to support. We provide direct technical assistance to communities. We have peer learning networks. We're actually launching a new program in Fairfield County that you might have seen to provide technical assistance to a group of communities, but we're also going to broaden that out to provide more webinar format toolkit conversations that any community can engage in. So I'll make sure that you all, have that information if you'd like to engage with us. And, just data research, we're just really trying to be a resource to help towns move forward in the ways that make sense for them so we can get more units built. So that's my presentation, and I am very happy to answer any questions.
Questions? Good.
Just a couple of questions. One would be in terms of the region itself.
Mhm.
Do you find that as a facilitator or an obstacle to success, the fact that we have so many individual towns?
It's interesting. I mean, I would say initially my answer would be it's an obstacle because everybody's recreating the wheel over and over and over again. But I will say I've seen a shift in recent years. I would like to say in part, with the work that we're doing with these centers working regionally, to say, we recognize that there are differences in different parts of the state, real differences, not only just sort of the narrative of how people talk about housing, but the cost of housing, people's relationship to community. It does vary regionally, but I am seeing that there's a lot more willingness and interest. You guys did it yourselves without anybody telling you to do it, to collaborate and figure out what the tools are that are working for folks so that we don't have to recreate it over and over again. So I think that seeing regions come together in that way kind of is a good way to balance, that kind of every man for himself, every town for himself. But okay, yes, we all know our solutions will be specific to us, but there are a set of best practices. We don't have to, all do it over and over and over again.
And then did you say was a 25-year plan?
So in my previous role at Regional Plan, I should have said, if I was doing my old presentation from RPA, I would explain that RPA has been around for 100 years in the tri-state region, and they've done 4 long-range plans for the region in that time, about once every generation. So the idea is that the plan, is done in a period of time, and then the work is to implement the plan. And then at a certain point, it feels like it's getting stale, and then, it's time to do it again. And that time frame has kind of shrunk over time because things have sped up in technology. So, the gap between the first and the second versus the third and the fourth, a little bit different, but it's a long range plan.
Can you share which towns, sorry, you're working with, Melissa, or is it?
It
is
hasn't
that-
yet been
or
announced.
Communities, okay.
But it will be announced pretty soon. It's a nice variety. Actually, they all say of, smaller towns, smaller cities, towns more like New Canaan. So a nice group. And I think what we may end up doing because of the applications that we got and sort of looking at the landscape is adding sort of a fourth, which may be interesting or applicable to you all folks who aren't quite there in terms of being ready on the ground to do a project, but really do want some assistance and some peer learning with other communities. So I think that may, to be determined, but maybe something we can announce pretty soon.
This is the initiative with the DOH.
With the Department of Housing, yeah.
Yeah, maybe if you could talk a little more about that.
Sure, yeah, so where do I start? So again, in my previous role, I've only been in my new role for 6 months. And my previous role, I was a partner organization with my current organization. So we've all been working very closely together, and I had the opportunity to move over and lead the effort. But so I'd been talking with the Department of Housing for a while in my previous role about what's needed, what's the gap well, there's, obviously a lot of gaps, but what do towns really need, in terms of capacity and technical assistance, especially smaller towns, and kind of what experts, resources could be brought to help communities move forward, because you have these local affordable housing plans that were mandated by the state. But then what, right? Everybody has a plan, and then how are you meant to implement it? So it was sort of an ongoing discussion about, what would really be useful, and where it landed was to put out an RFP, well, not really an RFP, a short application to just say, hey, which towns would like to participate, and ask a series of questions. We were really looking for investment of chief elected officials, planning and zoning commissioners, and planning staff. We're kind of thinking about, like, where do these things get hung up? You really need the leadership. And it has to be across, I think, those three areas within a community in order to really be meaningful. So that's what we were looking for. And it's really going to be designed to be very responsive to the local community. So there'll be individual work with each community to say, sit down, look at their plan, ask the question, what do you need? We're not here to tell you what you need. You tell us what resources. And so to work on those individually, but then to bring the folks together as a cohort. And so, do that peer learning. A lot of the plans, if you look at them across the board, they're asking for the same set of tools or similar tools. So having towns work together and say, we tried this, or we haven't tried this yet, but we think we're going to try this, and bringing experts to that, really trying to create a community of practice amongst towns, so that it doesn't feel like this lonely slog. And, and it could also be things like I talked about earlier on the community engagement pieces. There's a whole range of things that need to happen. So it's really whatever the communities tell us they need, that's really what we want to be providing through the program. And it's a pilot, so we'll see how we go, and then we'll recalibrate. I've had a few folks say, are you going to is there going to be a round 2? We're not quite ready. I'd say that's all to be determined in terms of the DOH piece of it. But for me, for the Fairfield County Center, to me, this is the work, that I am really excited to do. So I'll say from that perspective, yes, we will continue this work. We'll see what we learn with the first go around, and we'll fine tune the program, and we'll do more.
Hi, appreciate you talking about the importance of local control, and also recognizing that we are doing a lot of the things that you've put out on the list, but we're still dealing with a pretty fiendishly complicated onerous law, 830G. As Tom laid out at the beginning, there's a helpful change, but we've been struggling with this law. It has not been particularly successful in producing units in Connecticut. So have you taken an interest in that? Have you testified for changes in 830G? Have you talked about providing more state support for these initiatives, or housing vouchers, to more equitably distributing housing vouchers so we can take advantage of some of the support the states provide to tenants?
So a couple things. One, I don't specifically get involved in this role, and really, not much of my previous role in state legislative advocacy. There's a lot of organizations out there doing that work. So I really do focus on the work with local communities. I will say, and I know this won't be popular, that I do, regardless of the mechanics of what ought to be fixed with 830G or whether it should be thrown out or not, a mechanism in the state that is motivating towns to do the hard work that you're doing. I do feel that without something, towns probably wouldn't feel as motivated. So on that side, and that's maybe not a popular thing to say, but I'll be honest,
I think we're here because we recognize that this is the law and we need to work with it.
Exactly,
That
yes,
said,
yeah.
some support on
Yeah.
actual things that could help us get this job done
I hear
would be
you.
helpful.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I'll say on the housing voucher side, just one piece though too, there's a lot of folks in Connecticut that have vouchers and there's nowhere to go with them because we just don't have the affordable housing unit. So for me and my role, really focusing on creating units, wherever they are. But like I said earlier, I really do feel strongly that no town has to do everything, but everyone should do something, just to the point of, who are the people in our neighborhoods. The piece that gets me honestly still is during the pandemic, we all loved our essential workers so much. We were so grateful. We had so much gratitude and love, right? And I feel like that's really faded to the distance, that, workers can live one place and other people can live other places. And I think having communities where there are some opportunities for people to live where you work and to be part of a community that you are already part of is important. I mean, for me, with my kids, that's what I'm looking for. That's the community that I live in. So that's just my personal.
So just to
piece, yeah.
confirm, you don't testify at all?
Not in this role. I do not. In my previous role, I did.
I have, I've been trying to figure out for a while the relationship between all of these different partners that you listed at the beginning. And you said that they each kind of fill a different niche. So I was wondering if you could explain who they are and what they do so that we can try and figure out who we need to talk to.
Sure, no, 100%. So one of the things I noticed pretty early on when I began my work at RPA was I was running into the same sort of housing advocate people, all the
To
time.
me,
And
they all fall under one umbrella, but I'm sure they have different.
well, and we were working alongside each other doing kind of related but similar things, and certain organizations have different, kind of areas of focus. So to the point on legislative advocacy, Partnership for Strong Communities, that is, they're up in Hartford. They spend a lot of time thinking about and looking at that piece of the puzzle. We partner in Fairfield County with Community Foundation. You guys have the best community foundation. I shouldn't say that because I work with other community foundations, but they're amazing. Fairfield County, I just, I think, and you guys have a great community foundation here just locally in New Canaan. I think the community foundations are just fabulous partners. They've been really important thought partners and conveners with us. So in Fairfield County, it's the Fairfield County Foundation. In other parts of the region, we have the Community Foundation in Eastern Connecticut. We have folks up in the northwest part of the state. So that's been a really critical piece. The Housing Collective, where I am now, we're a backbone organization. So historically, our work has been focused on homelessness and really being the backbone organization that helps to coordinate all the service providers in Fairfield County and in the Northwest. About 5 or 6 years ago, there's a lot of conversation about we're not going to end homelessness if we don't create more affordable housing. So the Housing Collective started to do similar backbone work, trying to support and coordinate. And so the point really is to, work together in the sense that let's stop bumping into each other, replicating each other's work, kind of, I'll just say, fighting for funding. We're all small nonprofits. So let's work together, let's all do what we do best and let's coordinate on it. So that's really the structure. So the individual organizations do the work that they do, full cloth, and then together on some specific pieces of the work, we collaborate where it makes sense.
Okay. And do you have, you mentioned earlier, and it's something that's been on my mind for a while, community land banks as a mechanism to provide long-term affordability in a community. Are there such things in Fairfield County or land trusts?
There's one,
Affordable housing.
and we just started to do some research. What I want to really do is one of the things we provide is a toolkit with different topics like community land trust, accessory dwelling units, looking at the mechanical pieces so we can share out. So I'm happy to share and send some material to you. I haven't dug in as far as I'd like to, but in Stamford, actually, there's a community land trust that Housing Development Fund has been running for quite some time. There's one out in Eastern Connecticut in Mansfield, and there's a third, I can't remember, but you have 3 community land trusts right now in Connecticut. And that's a great example, just having those land trusts come and present to you about what it is they're doing, how they're doing it, whether it works, or, what the pieces are. Those are the kinds of peer learning things we want to be doing so that, we can figure out how it can work in a community or be tailored, but not having to start from zero and just, figure it out yourselves town after town.
Thank you.
So you mentioned homelessness. I mean, maybe you want to share with everybody what our number is in our state for homeless population.
I'll be honest, I don't work on that side of the house, so I haven't memorized those stats, but I'm really happy to connect. And I'm sure Jessica Kubicki, who runs the Opening Doors Initiative at the Housing Collective, would also be happy. I don't want to voluntold her without her, but I'm here tonight, but very happy to come and talk about homelessness and that side of, of the work. She has it all at her fingertips. I don't.
So that's around 3,000, a little bit over there, 3,500 maybe, I think is what our homeless population is here in Connecticut. So when we talk about a housing need, and you talked about that 30% of your income is going toward your housing, that includes your property taxes. It also includes your energy costs as well. And we know that Connecticut is second highest in property taxes and third highest in energy costs. So that's part of what makes Connecticut unaffordable. So those are issues as well that need to get addressed because that's an overall issue for anybody who lives in Connecticut, no matter what. Do you know when you talk about, because I think that's the number that everybody kind of pins it on, that's how much housing need there is, what percentage of that is homeowners versus renters?
I'm sorry, I'm not understanding where you're
So
going.
when you say that there's X number of homes that are needed, because
I don't think I said X number of homes that were needed today in this presentation.
okay, well, in general, all of the housing advocates that you work with do talk about a number, and it's about, I don't know what it is now, 120,000, something like that?
I saw 92,000 recently.
92,000 something, whatever, it depends on which day it is. But so the question to me is, how many of those what percentage of that is homeowners versus renters? Because the question that I was kind of coming to is, if you're a homeowner and it's expensive for you because your taxes are high, because your energy costs are high, is building a whole bunch of market value rentals going to solve that problem for you? Probably not. So I think that that's part of what needs to get drilled down on as well, is understanding, what that need is.
No, 100%. I couldn't agree more. And I'm not sure exactly what the question is in there, but I could just,
It was the breakout between homeowners
Well,
versus renters.
but I guess what I'm saying is, in terms of data and research, that's absolutely what we're doing with the center. And I'm very happy, if this committee has specific questions to share and provide research and data, I don't have it all at my fingertips today, but absolutely happy to dig in and really, look at those numbers together and see kind of what the implications are for New Canaan.
So, and then if we can go back to the slide that had the map of 91% of the state is single family. What's in that number? Do you know? Is that just single family detached homes, or is there anything else in there?
So what that number is specifically is 91% of land in the state is zoned for single family. It allows single family as of right. That's what that number is.
I think it's a little different because what's also in that, trapped in that number is the single family attached. So when I think about a town like New Canaan, which has a lot of townhomes, so and the definition would be a common wall, right? So when you find townhomes, when you find things like row homes, those are all in areas that are more town centric. It speaks to density, right? Because that's where that's going to happen, is maybe where you have sewer, where you can do that kind of building that's a little bit more densely created. And if we're putting something out like that and I think that's from Desegregate Connecticut, right?
It's the National Zoning Atlas.
Okay, right. Then it started from Desegregate Connecticut, right?
Maria.
I have questions.
I know, but if we could just focus, we know what the need is to some extent in New Canaan. We can debate statewide. That's not germane to what we're trying to accomplish here. And I understand what you're getting at, but I just think we're getting very off topic. And
Actually, I think it's very on topic, because when we talk about this, it's important that we have the same understanding
But I
of
know
what
you have an
density
issue with
is.
Desegregate Connecticut. I have an issue with CT 169 strong. We can sit up here and debate this. I don't think it's germane to what we're trying to accomplish here. Do you deny that there's a housing need?
Okay,
in
guys,
Connecticut?
I would like to finish my questions, and then you can have your
Yeah,
questions.
let's-
How's that?
I guess, Maria, can I just respond and just say that you can go on the National Atlas site, you can zoom in to New Canaan,
Mhm.
and you can see, the answer to your questions about, is it single family attached, is it detached? All of that data actually is on the National Atlas. So I do mean this very sincerely. Like, we are interested in making data available, democratizing data, making it accessible. So, the questions on data for sure are real and important, and for sure should be looked at. And I'm very happy if there are specific data questions, to follow up with.
And
you on them.
and so I do. I
Yeah.
am trying to get to a point here. So the point being that I think Partnership for Strong Communities, which you're also aligned with, says that we have 18% of however they define multifamily, which is 2+ units. But that also, that density, that gentle density that we have related to townhomes and things like that, that's excluded. So when we put out some statement about 91% being single family, everybody's picturing a lawn. They're picturing a lawn and lots of land, or, and that's not really the case. So I think we have to be careful about the way we're providing data. And I think that that's really relevant to everybody in every town, because when you look at the data, if you include into that density number, the number of units that we have in townhomes, we have about 28%. But Partnership for Strong Communities only recognizes us as having 18%. So it's a 10% difference, and that's just one town. So I think that's, and every town should be paying attention to that as part of the issue here. Let me see if there's anything else I wanted to point out. I don't have anything else for right now. Go ahead.
Okay, anybody else?
Melissa, thanks for all the good work you're doing, okay? And, I was trying to think back probably 2 regional plans ago. I did one for Seisha, which was out
Oh,
of
did you?
business,
Yeah.
okay? I think they're out of business. They changed their name, right? So,
I think there's still Seisha, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, out there.
so,
Yeah.
but one of the things I was missing from a business standpoint, it was, I understand the human side of homeless and people needing housing. But from a business standpoint, I think your case would be a lot stronger if you could demonstrate why businesses want this, because at the end of the day, they drive the economic engine.
Sure.
And then the other thing, which would, again, from a business standpoint, let's just say we fix the entire problem tomorrow morning. The next day, another 100,000 people would move in and we have the problem all over again. So my point being is I think the state has to have a plan. And I don't know if they have one, you might tell me, but if the state doesn't have a plan as to how they're going to deal with this, because the country has a problem.
Well, I think the
right?
interesting
And
thing.
it goes back a little bit to Maria's point, we didn't rehearse, but driving up the cost. So how do we deal with that? I don't expect you to have that answer tonight, but in your future presentations, you might want to deal with that.
Yeah, well, two things. I guess one on the business case for sure. Actually, we did a webinar with the center a couple weeks ago, I think end of April. David Genovese from Baywater, David Corus, with Stanford Downtown. And we also had Michelle McKay with Connecticut Main Street talking about the economic case for housing and what the relationship is between, the business community and housing. So one, yes, completely agree. I think in terms of the communications, the public discussion, having that be an important central part of it is critical. And it's interesting seeing groups like CBIA talking more about workforce housing, seeing the governor talk about workforce housing. I think there's more and more of a recognition that there's clearly, a relationship between economic health and workforce housing. That's clear. I think on the other point, in terms of a statewide plan, this is a challenge, right? Because as we all know, and the reason for being here in large part is the solutions are local, right? They're the local solutions. When the state says, do this or do that, communities generally are like, that's not, that doesn't work for us. So I think there really has to be that partnership between sort of the big picture and the state work and the local communities. And I think convening at a regional level makes a lot of sense because you can really feed up, that information better together up to the state as a region. But I really do think it is all hands on deck. We're not going to solve this with, one part of government. I know it's complicated and it's really messy and hard, but that's really the reality. It's the way our government functions. All the power, all the decision making is with local communities, local volunteers, right? Like you all and myself included. So it's not an easy one, and we're not going to solve it. And I think that's the point. We're not going to solve it, right? We just need to make it better for some families, for some people. We're not going to solve it in my lifetime, right? We're not going to create whatever the number is, 0 to 30%, 92,000 years in Connecticut. It's not going to happen. I'll say that it's not. But if we can help 1,000 families, whatever the number is, if you can help 50 families, 30, whatever it is, that those families and then the generations behind those families, you've made a real impact. So even if it feels hard and it feels kind of futile, like just think about that. That's what I think about, in the hard fights I work on, honestly, on my volunteer time, that's where I'm really here in my day job. I'm really here to be the technical assistance, the capacity building, the education, but I'm on the ground, doing that hard work that you're all doing, and it's messy and it's not always very fun, but
Melissa, are there any specific strategies for a smaller town like ours? So there's certain strategies that you're going to, pursue in a Norwalk and a Stamford.
mhm,
And then you're working with also smaller towns like ourselves.
yeah.
I mean, any specific strategies you would recommend that we think about to get this done within a small town context where cost is a challenge, density is a challenge? It's a different ballgame than, our friends
For
next
sure.
door.
Yeah, I'll say a couple things. One probably easy, one probably harder. And not easy, but I think where you can identify land, that's the hardest part, right? Are there any publicly owned properties that you all control? That's, or are there faith community properties that I don't know, New Canaan well enough to know, do you have, an old parochial school building that is whatever, looking for sites, that's the hardest part, right? And if you can look for sites that are more adjacent to commercial areas, obviously that's easier too. Staying out of single family neighborhoods is going to be your best bet, obviously, to move things forward. So looking for the right sites, number one. I would say this is harder, but in a place where it's a lot of single family zoning and you have large lots, thinking about what you can do with accessory dwelling units, can you do some kind of incentive where people can deed restrict an accessory unit? That's, I think, your other important option. And again, that's not going to add, I don't know, tons of units quickly, but at Westport, I think I might get this wrong. Please don't quote me. Don't quote me, Maria. I might have it wrong, but it's, I think, 30 or so ADUs that they've been able to bring online since, they updated their legislation. So I would look at that, see if that's something that's going to work. I think Fairfield is looking at doing a pilot to think about some incentives where they can incent first ADU is, you do that, but if you do the second one, there's another incentive for deed restricting. So those would be my recommendations. I think if you had more commercial area, I would say, hey, look at your strip commercial, those underutilized sites. Again, I don't know you well enough to know if you have any kind of, something on the periphery that maybe is kind of, not a very strong kind of, strip center. That would be somewhere else that you might look. Those places generally are served by water and sewer as well. So those are my top three, I would say.
Okay. Any last questions for Melissa?
So I have
For
a
you?
question. So looking at what RPA in the region, that there's only 3 counties, if you want to say that you're focused on. But really, I think the hardest thing for Connecticut is the fact that Fairfield County is so very different from the rest of the state. Our markets are very bifurcated. So ours, because of its proximity to New York, has much higher property values, rental costs, all of those things. And I've read a number of studies that have talked about the importance of trying to provide more assets to these communities. So vouchers, as Chris mentioned, very important for us to try to get more vouchers here versus the enormous abundance of vouchers that are given to Hartford and New Haven. So if you think about that, those are sort of the things that would help, I think, in a short-term basis, more so than some of these other things. And that's one of the problems. And the only other thing is, I wonder, because of the connection with RPA and desegregate and all that. And so these plans are all very developer focused. So I've heard criticism that part of the reason some towns are hesitant to get involved with your organization is because of the developer focused nature, that it may be very, may not be as objective, let's say, is what's been said to me. Relative to, maybe going to Westcog or someone else who could also do a, objectively focused on the town. So my question to you is, how do you manage that? So to not be as just developer focused and really focused on, here's the limitations of a town with this much capacity of sewer and population and all the other things, because that's what I've missed in some of these legislation and the bills that have come out, is that they don't really work well with a lot of towns of different sizes, because it's really a one size fits all. So
I guess
that's my
2 things.
question.
One, I'll reiterate on the vouchers. The problem is if you have a voucher and you have nowhere to use the voucher is not useful. And there are a lot of folks in that position that have vouchers and nowhere to use them. Secondly, on the question, I don't know if it's a question about RPA or more of an accusation, but I'm not going to, get down a road of trying to defend an organization, but I worked there for 8 years. I can tell you it's the smartest people I've ever worked for or with, and they are honest brokers who are doing great research. And there may be, I guess, conspiracy theories about the motives of the organization, but that wasn't my experience. And I can only speak to my experience. Working on the 4th regional plan was one of the best experiences as a planner in my career. It was so thoughtfully done, so nerdy. And yeah, I mean, that's just my perspective. But, I'm just here to share information. If folks want to work with us, that's great. If they don't, you don't have to. I'm not here to kind of, sell my services or anything like that. Just really do want to have good conversation and share some good information.
Thank you for coming. I hope the merit is much better.
It'll be better on the way
traffic
home.
heading
I'll get
back
my
to
Dunkin',
Rochester.
I'll put on the radio. It'll be great.
But I think one thing you've heard is, if there is the toolbox, so to speak,
Mhm.
that you have, feel free to share it with us.
Very happy to. And I will
And-
share
and specific to a smaller footprint as
Yeah,
opposed to.
for sure. The work on ADUs as that's developing, and then the community land trust piece in particular, and other tools for sure, we'll send them your way. And feel free to reach back out. We're happy to be a resource, but only if you want us to be.
And
So,
please keep us posted on your cohort.
yes, absolutely
and
will.
How
Yeah.
that goes and who's in it, because we might be able to learn, even if we're not part of the first one, as we are not, but we might be able to learn from communities that are similar to us. in some
Fantastic. Yep, no,
situations.
definitely we'll do that. I do really like the idea of putting together a group for folks who aren't quite ready to just be part of a peer learning network. So we'll get back to you on that for
Right.
sure.
Thank you
Well,
again.
thank you for the
Drive
invitation.
safe.
It was great to be here.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, item number 4, affordable
Mr.
housing strategies, remarks and discussion. Bob, I'm pulling the thing closer. Is that better, Bob?
Oh, you're on, oh, no, you're not.
No, I'm
We
on.
jumped into modifying the agenda and Tom O'Day's talking. Did I miss that we approved the agenda? I don't think we.
We did approve it.
We did, okay.
Yep.
That was my fault then.
So item number, yeah, we did. Item number 4, affordable housing strategies, remarks and discussion regarding strategies with Margarita Albin, Greenwich Planning and Zoning Chairman, and Jeremy Ginsburg, Darien, Director of Land Use. Come on up, guys. So I'll make comments on both of these individuals. Don't start going off on me until you sit down, please. So as everybody can tell, Marguerite and I have a history.
But we've never met in person before.
I know, isn't it amazing?
Is that,
first
is that
Wow.
true?
Yeah.
Yeah, like 5 years, 6 years.
yeah.
Never met in person before.
So back when I chaired planning and zoning, which
I'm gonna
we
get closer,
had
it doesn't
and you
echo.
all continue to have, is we had a group of planning and zoning chairs. And I would get on the calls with these other planning and zoning chairs, and particularly with Margarita, I'd be like, is there 36 hours of time in the day for you? I mean, you just were nonstop. So this is one of the smartest planning people and hardest working I've ever
He's
run
gonna say
into.
something about it.
And then Jeremy, you and I had never met. That's correct. But I sat on planning and zoning for 17 years. And every time we would have a discussion with the new Canaan planner, whichever planner it was, we'd just say, well, what's going on in this other town? Or what's going on in the area?
You can say it.
And the first thing they would say is call Jeremy Ginsburg at Darien. So both of you, welcome.
Thank you.
You're aware of what we're working on. So if you'd like to provide us with remarks, and then we'll get into Q&A.
Sure. Darien is very much in a similar situation as New Canaan in terms of some of the obstacles we face. And these are what you talked about earlier, the moving target obstacle, which is at this time of year when the legislative session is over, we get to work, we have meetings like this, we start working on plans, programs, and before you know it, the next legislative session comes with other dictates, things you need to do. You need to change your parking standards. You need to do an affordable housing plan. You need to eliminate minimums of sizes of units. I haven't seen this year. Oh, this year you have to do reporting once a year.
Yep.
It will change. and
5474.
Yeah. And sure enough, before you can do the legwork, you're forget chasing moratorium, you're chasing legislation. And this was a short session. So what we've already seen, and Margarita and I were talking before, was that we're already seeing emails from advocacy groups saying, here, both sides saying, we look forward to the long session so we can, and as planners, myself, who are on the ground working with land use boards, planning and zoning commissions, it's a never-ending cycle of drop everything. We have to react to this legislation and we have to address it right away. Some legislation, as Tom O'Day mentioned, goes into effect in October, but I know last year or 2 years ago, it went into effect in October, but you had to address it by December. And you know, a lot of boards like yourselves may not meet in December. That's what all the boards, all 169 communities are dealing with. Volunteers having to drop the local plan reviews and dig into responding to. I'll get off my soapbox for 2 minutes, but Darien, like yourself, worked through the moratorium process up at the state level, up in Hartford. We were one of the first communities to have 2 moratoria. I'm sure New Canaan will join us shortly, and that'll be great. The third is the hardest because you've already gotten the easy projects up. And then it's, as Melissa referenced, finding land or rezoning. And we, like New Canaan, rely a lot on the private sector to build. So when you have a bad economy or COVID or something that gets in the way of the private sector, you can approve all the plans you want. We've had projects approved that just sit there. So we say, we just keep approving projects, but they're beyond our control. We can't force a developer or builder or the private sector. We can't force them to build anything. We rely upon them. We can give them approvals. We can give them incentives, but you're still relying on outsiders to get you those units. And we talk about building different types of housing. Only certain types count for a moratorium. So we'll talk more, I'm sure, about accessory dwelling units, that if Margarita was to build one in her backyard and rent it to a local teacher, that's not going to count. Even if she deeds restricted, it won't count because for 830G points, you have to open them up to the general public. So Margarita might know a teacher in Greenwich who income qualifies and says, oh, I'd love you to live in my backyard in the unit right here, or up in my attic or wherever. It would not count towards 830G. So ADUs might be solving a different problem, middle housing, increasing housing supply, but the state at this point does not count it towards a moratorium. Similarly, Darien has built housing for the developmentally disabled, young adults who they're never going to be making $100,000 a year. We have units that some on town property, some built by the private sector. Again, a great thing to have, fills a gap, fills a need, doesn't get you moratorium points. So Darien has made the conscious effort. Look, we're not going to chase moratorium points. That's just one sliver of the market. And we're pleased to say we just passed ADUs, takes effect in Darien June 30th. We're working as a staff to get that up and running. So that was passed by planning and zoning a couple weeks ago. We're working on some other things. Moratoriums there, it would be nice, but we're working in different directions to try to fill different needs. Take it from there. I know.
Okay.
Well, and last thing, when
Just
Tom
when I make a
started,
joke or something?
no. When Tom started, he talked about bringing legislators down. And when he brought, I think it was Senator Rojas down to see what's going on. Governor Lamont was kind enough to come down to Darien. I think it was late in the fall. And obviously representatives like Mr. O'Day and others came to Darien to say, here's what we're working on. If you're sitting in a legislative building in Hartford, you may not understand what's going on in New Canaan, Greenwich, Darien, but when you go, like Governor Lamont did and the representatives, and see 100 construction workers with hammers and nails, big holes in the ground, projects recently completed, the governor's like, I didn't know this was going on. They don't, right? They're not sitting in Hartford saying what great work Darien's doing. They don't know. Oh, I didn't know Greenwich was, and it's what remind me, Byram and Coscob and Old Greenwich, how dense they are.
Yep.
Very high density,
Very
some of the
dense.
highest density outside of Norwalk
I
and
think
Stanford.
it's 60% of the population of Greenwich lives on less than a third of it, an acre. So that picture of us being very spread out is not correct.
Take it from there.
ADUs as of right, you guys also, right? Agree with Jeremy that, sorry, I have really bad allergies today. And of course, they only hit when I started talking. Not going to chase a moratorium here either. We're at 5.8%. And you're just chasing it and you get it for 4 years. And then what? You guys know we have, I'm sorry, I was fine before. We have an affordable housing trust, same house. Thank you so much.
Margarita, if it's easier, we can hit Jeremy with some questions.
Sure.
So these things work. Okay, that looks like a plan. He knows what we're doing because we talk a lot
Yeah.
with Alvani.
Questions for Jeremy?
Jeremy, first of all, thank you both so much for being here. I'm Jane Williams, I spoke with you. It's nice to meet you in person. Both of you have mentioned, but we'll give Margarita a little time, not chasing
I'll just go on the
moratorium.
floor and, okay.
So what are your strategies then?
It's a good question. We have a couple strategies. One is the ADUs, which is not going to get us moratorium points. We do have 3 major projects. As you know, Darien has a number of train stations. One is in Norotan Heights, one in downtown Darien. And the Planning and Zoning Commission has done some rezoning near those train stations. And
What did you zone it to? Why don't you just?
well, we'll say in downtown, David Genovese, who many of you may have met, came in with a proposal. He, over a 10-year period, bought basically a whole city block. He bought 10 different properties totaling numerous acres. It took him many, many years. And he rezoned it as a whole. Commission gave him much greater height. The tallest building will be 5 stories. Darien usually allows 2, sometimes 3. It will be a big difference in downtown Darien, but the way the commission rezoned it was that building is behind two other buildings. So you'll never see that whole building. There's nowhere in town to see it. It's tucked behind the building and next to the turnpike. So when you're driving down the turnpike, you'll see a building. So we
Let
really
me-
got a good location.
Let me jump in.
Sure,
I
sure,
can
go
jump-
ahead,
Let
go
me
ahead.
jump in for a second on that. So we made a mistake. We have something very similar, 0.6 miles from the train station. It's currently before us, so I can't comment too much on the details, but came to us several years ago and we denied it. 12 lots. And we said no because it was going to be 6 stories. So now it's back as an 830G. So we could have rezoned and we could have given them the height. And instead it comes back as an 830G because we don't have a moratorium. So when you don't go after a moratorium, it's a scary ride because you have no control over what's going on in your town and you can't predict it. So you're better off in some ways, I think in retrospect, biting the bullet and rezoning certain areas that you might doing it you first rather than have the state impose something on you like the TOC that we didn't want to do. None of us wanted to have that imposed. We now have this. It's great because as many of you know, we also have an affordable housing trust. That affordable housing trust has funded this proposal for the 12 lots. It's 120 units, but because of the way 830G is written, and nobody's been able to refute this, if you have a government entity, which your trust isn't, as we've discussed, if you have a government entity and you assist a project, you can turn it into AMI. So that building is at 80% of AMI instead of the split that you get under the set-asides. As a result, we're getting 40% affordable, and 40% of the units in that building will count. So that's 120 units that we're doing. We're doing another 100 units, also transit-oriented, also within, this one's much closer to the train station, 100 units. Same kind of thing. We're fighting still on that. We're probably only going to do 30% affordable because the trade-off is we reduce the height of the building. So the trust goes, finances it, converts it to 80% AMI, but you may not get a higher percent than the 30 because you reduce the number of floors. So we're trying to keep our architectural scale and enhance affordability. Our housing authority then picks up the deeply affordable need. That's the theory. So they do the 80% of SMI and below, while the trust is doing 80% of AMI because our assumption is you need both tiers of housing. So that's on that. I just wanted to jump in slightly
Same thing,
different,
Darien. The
different,
housing
slightly.
authority really covers the
The deeply
30%,
affordable.
40%, 60% of SMI because they're not the private sector. So they can, that's their job really as a local housing authority. And
But it's still that's, so you're doing that. I think you guys are doing something similar because you have a housing authority as well. So you're looking at that. And you just did, I always forget what the name of that big project that your
Canaan
trust.
Parish.
Then the problem with not doing a moratorium is the trust is working with people who propose small 830Gs. Some of those 830Gs, for example, we just approved a 10-unit building. Seems okay, right? It's in a single-family neighborhood. The neighbors are having a meltdown. There's no way we could deny it. It's an 830G. I would love to not have that happen. I would love to have apartment buildings in areas that are proximal to transit, that make sense for commuters. This is just in a single-family neighborhood in the middle of nowhere.
one thing Darien has done, for better or worse, I guess we'll find out, is they had office parks. And they've allowed by special permit, multifamily. So we've started seeing conversion of, or more likely knocking down the office building. We had one last year, 3 Parklands Drive. It was an office build, 2-story office building, 2 or 3 stories, and they're gonna knock it down and put up a 56-unit apartment building. Now we have another office park that an application has come in to basically put it in that multifamily zone. And it's 10, 12 acres, so we're likely to see that get converted. It's tough we're like New Canaan, we don't have a big commercial tax base. When you start converting your commercial tax base, housing advocates will want more and more and more housing, but we have to think of the entire community and, we want to keep a commercial tax base. How do we find that balance?
Ours is only 20% of our grand list, the commercials. What we've done, we had an idea a couple of weeks ago. We've approached the churches to see if anybody has vacant land, underutilized. Because, for example, they have those big parking lots. You could do a parking structure and then you could redevelop those parking lots. So we started with one of the Catholic churches and now we're going to the pastors and rabbi and everybody associated with a group of them. They meet apparently all the time. So we're going to go in and talk to them and see if they would reconsider redevelopment. But I don't know if it's feasible. Finding land, as we all know, the cost is a killer. The 5474, did your attorney talk to you about it tonight after all? 5474 has a clause in it that the state is supposed to make its surplus land available. Westport did that. You remember,
Yeah.
John? Westport got a big chunk of state underutilized land.
Yeah.
We haven't tried. We do have, our housing authority is looking at converting one of our train station parking lots into 100% affordable. So I don't know if that's going to go forward. That's very early days. And we'll see if the state loosens anything up. We've been asking them for a long time, but I mean, the land's expensive.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
So in Greenwich, is the goal to hit the 10% perhaps so that you avoid, or do
We're
you
not
think
sure.
that you could apply for you might apply for a more?
I don't think we'll apply for a moratorium. I just, if it's there, maybe we would. But our sense is we're close to 6% right now.
Right.
We would have to add 2%. Now you're at 8%. What is it worth doing? Because 4 years later, you're back to trying to get that extra 2%. Why not just keep going? I don't know the answer. I'm assuming that it won't be my decision by then. But I'm not sure we
Not going anywhere.
can hit the 10%. It just gets hard.
Okay.
And there are a lot of people who are upset about the mathematics of it, who think that you can never get to the 10% with the goal, with the algebra of for every 10 years. Okay. But in fact, the math does work. It's just that for those of us who love algebra, it does work. You do eventually get there. But there are a lot of people who make it their political opinion that you can never get to 10% if you do 830G set-asides. I also told Jane when she asked me if I wanted to speak, we are encountering more resistance as we build and approve than I had anticipated. Even though you tell people that this is the law and it's been the law for 35 years. I had a guy send me an email the other day that he wants Greenwich to secede from the state. I mean, it sounds great, but I don't think anybody would recognize us as a sovereign nation.
Never know till you try.
There may be
And-
a few
and then I
hedge
asked him-
funds and private equity.
So I asked him if he wanted to join Westchester and he said, no, not really. And I said, well, so, and he said, well, I just want to make the point. Well, okay. There are people who just want to say no to 830Gs and who just hate the concept of being forced. And those people are actually, I feel like they're becoming stronger. They're voicing it more recently. I've been doing this a while. And I feel like we're hearing more from them. I had somebody say to me the other day that they wanted to vote against it on the commission. They said, I want to just vote against the 830Gs now. And I said, well, you're going to then lose in court. And then you have no control at all. But there is that resistance. It's difficult for people because you've lost control of your local zoning, even though you see the need. We know that we have a lot of low-income people who live in town and their needs aren't being met, but it's still hard for people to feel they've lost control. And I feel like they're reacting more now that they're seeing stuff built. So you too. Did Corbin get that kind of reaction?
It's tough. Right now, the big projects we have are under construction, so people are looking at the holes in the ground, but they haven't seen it come out of the ground. And I'm sure I will get many complaints as they see 3, 4, 5-story buildings going in very close to the street. It's going to be great when it's done. It'll look fantastic. Phase 1 of the project is done. If you haven't been to Darien, I would encourage you on a day when there's not a lot of traffic on 995 to come down, take a look.
Dude, Jeremy, what?
There is no day. So to take a
What
look.
are you
and
guys
get a s-
smoking in Darien?
It's just tough when you
It's
get
tough.
995 going right through the middle of the town. It makes things difficult.
So-
But take
so-
a look. It's much high. If you go to Norotan Heights across the street from the train station, Federal Realty, they're a big real estate investment trust. They did big 3-story buildings. The first floor is residential, retail, restaurants, 10, 12-foot ceilings. And then you have your 2 stories of apartments above that. So these are tall buildings, which was taking the place of a 1-story building. People are looking up. A lot of it, it's a different vibe, a different character, a different feel. It's the right place to build that project. It's across the street from the train. It's a block from I-95. It's what we find is they've sold out the residential part. That was easy. And they're working on filling in the restaurant, retail. I like the project. It's a lot more fun, a lot more interesting, a lot going on. But not everyone's happy. Change is difficult.
So on that, one of the things that I wish we were doing better, and we keep tinkering with it, is our inclusionary zoning regulation is not working. Yours works, right?
Well, one interesting part, and we can talk a little bit more, the way it's written is whether to take the fee in lieu, which we'll talk about, or to have the units built on site is at the sole discretion of the commission. So sometimes you'll have a builder developer come in and say, I really want to build them on site. Sometimes you say, I'm here with my checkbook, I'll just write you a check. But ultimately, it's up to the commission.
One of the things about not doing them on site, I had a conversation with the Commissioner of Housing, with Seila Mosquera Bruno, and we talked about what happens when you separate a project in two, when the low-income people are here and the higher income are over there, and they are not supportive of that. She does not feel that that's the purpose of what we're trying to do. She wants to see everybody together. I can really see that, and that was my take as well. So we wouldn't necessarily want to do something where you do a fee in lieu, because I, for one, right now, I'm not comfortable with that. Our inclusionary zoning doesn't work because we give people a bonus. We don't mandate it. We give people a bonus to do below market in a building. And people don't feel we're giving them a sufficient bonus, and they'd rather do an 830G. Westport did fine with theirs because they had a moratorium. So builders were obliged to make the inclusionary work. We tried the same numbers as Westport and it didn't work for us. It just wasn't enough zoning incentive for a builder. What they told us, I can't remember, you guys don't do FAR, right? That you guys don't.
Largely
No,
went
not
away
really.
from it. We
Okay.
used to have it.
Yeah, you used to have it. I think Ridgefield still does. So we do FAR and we were letting them go to a 0.75. They wanted 0.9, the max of 0.9. The 830Gs are coming in at around 1.5.
Yeah.
Those of you who know how, just to give you a sense on a lot, if we mandate it, we'd have to give people enough bonus to move them away from the 830Gs. I'd like to do that because you could maybe get more scale. What residents want the most is they want to stay with lower buildings, right? You too, right? That's what we're all seeing. So if we could give a bonus that somehow keeps the scale lower, but we haven't hit that number and it's not working for us. So we're getting 830Gs instead.
Sorry, go ahead, Mary.
Go ahead.
Margarita, so can you just go through, I know Westport's at 20%. Is there inclusionary policy if I?
Yeah,
if I
it's at
recall?
20.
And
That's
if-
what we
are
would do.
Both of your inclusionary policies?
Same.
14%.
Okay.
And ours is 20 and yeah, it's 20 and we would reduce it. I think that's what we want to do is reduce it. We keep debating.
Right. So you know, we've increased it over time. We've had inclusionary zoning for about 10 years now, and the commission tweaks it. So now it's 14% of the units on site need to be set aside for, I think it's 80% SMI.
We've had it since 87 and I would say we've tweaked it as well and it's failed every time. So we're just having trouble getting it. The other thing that's on my mind a lot, just to throw it out there, is Airbnb, short-term rentals. Doesn't seem like they have much to do with affordable housing, but they do. Because they take units off the market and they push the price up of both rentals and home ownership. So to the extent, if there's some lawsuits against Airbnb that if they prevail, Airbnb will start telling towns what is in their town. To the extent that we could have some more control with the Airbnbs, it might, or in the VRBOs as well, it could help because it is reducing the supply. I think that's been a huge impact that nobody's really counting in the market. So I don't know whether we'll see that resolve or not. You guys don't
Do you guys
allow.
have
it's very- we
regulations
don't-
on short-term rentals?
Hmm?
Do either of you have regulations?
Yeah, we allow them and the owner has to be on site and it can only be, there's conditions, but the problem is we have no data. So how do you enforce it when all of us have minimal enforcement staff, right? So how do you enforce it? If we had a monthly report, we'd know what was in town, who owns it, because a lot of people have multiple properties and they're not on site, but we don't know who they are.
Right.
I'm just being really brutally honest here, but.
Question about I find that the land trust,
This is we don't buy land,
no, you don't buy land, but you have a housing trust, the housing
Right.
trust?
and you guys have one too, and so does Darien.
Yeah, but yours seems to be better funded.
No,
Different.
not
It's
really.
different, right?
Well, you see, the law doesn't say how much you have to fund something for it
Correct.
to be assisted.
Correct.
So our trust gives a developer $50,000.
Okay.
Okay, now, we are about to hit a bunch of funding. We have some ARPA money.
Okay.
We didn't do well raising money. We do not have, you guys have a fee?
Yeah, building
Okay,
permit,
we
yeah.
don't have a fee. It's all volunteer donations. That didn't go really well. I think we have $30,000 from that. We have ARPA money and then part of a development is actually doing almost a fee in lieu, only they didn't have mandatory inclusionary.
So I've looked
Yes,
into
sir.
this a little bit. There is a difference. Excuse me, ours is a segregated account within the town. Yours is a true trust with a declaration of trust. We're gonna get somebody in, maybe a couple people in from the Greenwich Housing Trust, the Darien Housing Trust for our next
Great.
Finance Committee meeting.
Oh, great. Okay.
So what I would,
We'll learn more.
so
Great.
what I would suggest you do, honestly, is I wrote our trust, and John knows this. I stole it from Stanford. Okay, just so you know, I didn't go to law school. So I just took Stanford's and then we worked with Stanford. They knew we were doing it, but theirs was very well crafted. It is wordy. It's a lot more, I think yours is a little short thing. Darienne's is pretty short. This is big town, big thing. And, but it's a branch of the government, which was what we wanted.
It's tough to also, Stanford has many more projects going on.
Right.
You know, at Darien, at any one time, you might have one or two projects that's building affordable housing. And so you might have this pot of money, which is dedicated to affordable housing. And I think if you look at our code of ordinances, it's not for soft costs. It's not for someone to draw up a plan. It's for actual, I think the word is construction, building, those types of things. So that becomes, you can use it to help build projects. And I think part of one of our housing authority projects used money from the trust fund to help them build deeply affordable housing. But it is tough. There's so few of projects building it to find a project to give the money to. Now you have a lot more money because you have that dedicated fund from your building permit, which Darien has talked about, like, wow.
How do you fund yours?
We don't do it through the inclusionary fee in lieu.
Oh. Our RTM didn't want us to do that. So maybe in a couple of years, we'll come back and
So
revisit it.
how would each of you guys think about, so in our situation, it's our mandate is meeting the next moratorium, so to speak. That's our
Yeah,
mandate. and we
I
can debate
gathered
that.
because your first selectman was on a meeting with us and it seemed like you were really working
Well,
on that.
that's town council. We're operating under an ordinance and
Right.
that's the mandate. So we have properties.
You have properties.
We have vacant properties. I mean, how would you think about that examination process? That's one question. And then the second question is, I guess it's called land banking, but, would you think about, playing small ball, so to speak? I mean, do you ever look at buying smaller properties, rehabbing? Now, everybody tells me the economics are terrible, but how would you think of each of those two respective ideas?
I can give you a little background. At Darien, we had a project it's back in I think it was the 80s, Mike, you might have been around for that. Clock Hill Homes, which is the town bought the property, it was an acre or two, and they brought in a private developer to build affordable housing, but it was owner occupied. And that became very difficult for the town to manage because unlike a rental, we just say, do you income qualified? Great, move on in. With owner occupied, there's that difficult problem is they're relying on the bank for financing.
Mhm.
So you can't make too much money or you don't income qualify. But if you make too little, no bank is going to let you buy the house. And then when you sell the house, the town has to then insert itself into the sale process. I would not recommend doing that. It's a great project. It created 30 units, but from a town standpoint, small town standpoint, the managing an organization, very difficult. Rentals are a lot easier. The other advantage of rentals is it's a 10-year rental, it's a 2-year, whatever rental, then you can do a lease for the entire, whatever it is, and say in 50 years, 60 years, we're out of this, or we're going to redevelop it or whatever. But by doing it as a rental, there's defined timeframes. It's really tough for someone to own it and then say, I don't know how you would take away their equity. So in that case, rental or, I don't know, it would be much more tricky to sell it. something
Oh,
like
so
that.
that's,
I would have to go to the RTM.
well, okay, talk about sale in a minute, because I want to, I have had this crazy idea I want to talk to you guys about. Have you thought about your housing authority issuing an RFP
Or land that we.
on the vacant land you have? And see what you get?
I think that's a possibility that the town issues an RFP, yeah.
And you could go to other,
Well, I think conceptually, we would suggest to the town, the RFP would, with the
because,
town's approval could come from us, but.
I mean,
an
if you
RFP
want
from
to
somebody.
evaluate vacant lots, what better way than having somebody tell you what they'd build on them? Stamford has a great housing authority. The Westport one is shared with Fairfield, right? That's very well, there's some really well-run housing authorities in the state. I think it might be worth seeing what people give you. I would, our housing authority doesn't want to do that. They don't want to, they want to do all their own development. But I would love to see what other people propose to us. That's it, and it's a very good way of getting an assessment and getting your finance guy highest and best use out of it. Ownership, we have an 830G that is part condo. And we're discovering that the way the law works, and I don't know much about this, is there's a big haircut you take when you try to do ownership. The state law pretty much needs to change so that the folks that are living in a below market condominium get more of the appreciation in the real estate.
Very tricky. Yeah.
Right.
Because everyone else is, right? Everyone who lives in a single family house, your housing is appreciating and you, when you sell, will get the appreciation. That is not able to occur because there's a max they can sell it for. And that becomes very
It
tricky.
only rises based on the income on the SMI, on the income levels, not based on what the real estate is doing. I think it might be kind of cool if the Fairfield County towns tried to get a bill that said, and they don't want to open up 830G. You heard Melissa, they don't want to open up 830G at all because they feel it's the only tool that exists. But what if we got a bill that allowed some sort of better appreciation on ownership? Because that's the ticket to building equity for the below market people. So when we started working with this condominium thing, I don't know much about it. And I started thinking, wow, we really should propose that bill. So I may work on it maybe over the summer. We'll see.
But yeah, Darien Housing Authority, they own 2 properties in Darien, and in the past 15, 20 years, they've basically doubled the density on each one. One is the Heights at Darien, which is on Norotan Avenue, that went from 53 units to
Beautiful.
106. And the other is the Royal at Darien, which is more of an apartment building look. They went from 30 units to 55. So they've built out the properties they own. I think very successful. I think the Heights at Darien.
Oh, it's
looks
gorgeous.
Townhouse style. It looks great. If you get off at exit 10, go 2 blocks
It's
north.
really beautiful.
It's
I mean, when you
very
get off
nice.
the exit, when you get off exit 10, I always text the Darien PNC chair and say, I really like those buildings. We've done small lots. The Housing Authority has bought 2 FAMs and has been using them. To be honest, they tend to use them at something that approximates market because there are certain properties the Housing Authority uses to generate cash flow so that because they're self-funded, right? So that's happening. The other thing is that Greenwich does have, again, it doesn't count for 830G, but we have extensive 2-family zoning. So that's why we have so much density and that's why we have that's where the lower income is concentrated in town.
Wasn't sure it was understanding the appreciation point. You're saying that a renter gets the appreciation?
Buyer,
So when
The
the town,
buyer.
at Clock Hill Homes, you have to income qualify. You can't make more than, call it $150,000 a year or whatever the number turns out to be, but you don't get the full appreciation out. So if a 1 or 2 bedroom condo is appreciating, you bought in at a number, which is below market rate number, you're not going to get the full appreciation out because we still have to make sure that the next person, when you move out, who makes 150,000 can afford to move in. So there's a few guardrails in there, but you're not going to get the full appreciation that if you lived in the same unit elsewhere that wasn't restricted. So, and it becomes very difficult for the town to manage. The town has to manage the waiting list. First person you got to wait for the first person to get vetted by the bank. It takes forever. Maybe they do, so
it's
rentals
tough.
move a lot quicker.
And the developer for this one that has condominiums says that for every below market condominium he's doing, and bear in mind, this is for 80% of AMI, he has to give up, we lose 5 rentals, 5 to 6 rental units because of the haircut he takes on selling on the sale price. So the sale price of a below market at 80% of AMI is 1/5 of the full market, whereas rent runs around 2/3. So that lack of parity in the market kept surprising me, and then I finally understood it's because. So I'd love to work on that. It may be way over. It may be just it's very technically complex and it's very hard. I don't know how you explain it to the legislature.
You probably should know this answer to this question, but is there a residency requirement?
No, there is not
None.
in any,
So when you're building something by the train station,
no. And it's ironic because, the theory is if you build something near a train station, those are people that want to go into New York,
or
but they
the
don't
people-
have to be.
Or the people from New York who want to move to New York.
Right.
Right.
We've seen that. Right. So
I
we've,
was really getting back to just, if you believe solving the problem from the earlier presentation is the objective, I wasn't quite sure exactly how building the residence at the train station accomplishes that. But
right.
Yeah,
Well,
it's always been a struggle. It's one of my struggles with TOC. I don't understand how, I'm sorry, I'm going to get on my soapbox. Sorry. I don't, you guys have heard me on this, but I don't understand. I also think that transit oriented is dated. It was a pre-pandemic concept. With the amount of work from home, I really believe we should be focusing on more walkable communities and making our communities walkable here because you may have 2 or 3 days of work from home right now. What you want to do is reduce all the trips. Some people may be commuting into the city and they would be interested in being by a train station. But the other question in my mind is why would you live near a big old train station in the burbs to commute into the city? What are you getting in terms of quality of life? So if we could do walkable communities with cluster homes and townhomes. That gives people the trees and open space and green areas that would be more consistent while meeting the below market need. But when I've testified at the legislature, especially the first year the DSEG bill was out, nobody wanted to hear that. And that was in the middle of the pandemic and nobody wanted to hear it. I think now people are starting to come around that maybe work habits have changed, but what you're raising is essential.
Yeah, and people, I think that was mentioned earlier, is Greenwich especially is a suburb of Manhattan.
Yeah.
And Darien to a lesser extent, because it's a 45-minute commute on
But
the
you
train.
guys are a
And
sub,
you
I mean,
guys as well.
you've got.
So what you see is that New York, as New York, Manhattan changes, we all feel the effects of whatever's going on in Manhattan.
Great. Anybody else? Everybody good? Mike?
So I'm curious about your inclusionary zoning reg. New Canaan has a reg, and there's
Does it
been some
work?
success with it. And when, and I don't speak for the commission, but I think when they passed it, they were, balancing density, balancing parking,
Mhm.
balancing height, trying to get the sweet spot where they thought it would be palatable, but also then try to encourage some inclusionary zoning. And there's been some success. I think there's been a couple projects I think that have been approved. I'm curious, the result that you've had with your regs. And the second part to my question was, chasing the numerator when, you're just doing a 10%. But I think Jeremy touched on that already, where you tweaked it up to 14%.
We did.
It's kind of a drop in a bucket, but albeit, but that sort of slightly eats into the numerator.
Yeah, as what our inclusionary zoning only applies to developments of 5 units or greater.
Same.
So what you find is someone's building a 5-unit, someone might build a little small development, but they're like, they go to the commission and say, please don't make me have to manage one affordable unit. We have to go out and advertise and track this person down, confirm every year, send you paperwork every year that you send on to the state, confirming that they still qualify. Please relieve me of that burden. I'd rather write you a check. We have seen some developers are more willing to do it than others, especially as the scale of their projects get bigger and bigger. Some of them are more willing, some are not. As Margarita said, the state is not a big fan of moving things around. So again, you get a situation where we're doing the right thing, but just not the way they want.
Right. This is the question.
This becomes well, we're trying to do what you want us to do, but you're still not. So it is closely monitored, Mike. I think that's what we continue to do, is kind of keep track. Is it working? We're not losing ground towards 830G. We're not losing ground to the 10%, but we're not ratcheting it up fast enough with those small inclusionary projects. We're just basically treading water on those.
How many projects have been built under our inclusionary zoning? I mean, it's one thing to approve
0.
them, but to your
Yeah.
point,
We just
that I think you were
passed it.
saying, it's like, who are they building these projects? So we had the one on Burtis, right?
One
in
on
Cherry.
Burtis is the only one that has been approved, and that was approved 18 months ago, 2 years ago,
So the
and
problem
has not
is,
been built.
is building it, because you don't get credit for what you've approved, right?
Yes.
You have to get credit for what's
So, I mean, I
available.
think it's too early to call it a success or a failure to say what needs to be tweaked or not. We need some more projects in order
It's
to
also
really.
probably the toughest 18 months in real estate
Right.
development, so.
Right.
Totally
And
understood.
interest rates change and all that.
Yeah.
That, again, beyond the town, when you talk about what's beyond the town's control, interest rates would be the most important thing. And when the new bill that passed that requires every town, probably the town planners in every town, to do the paperwork on reporting to the state, how many units were approved, how many units were built. And what I'm sure the state will end up seeing is towns approve lots of units. Not all of them, they're not all rushing out the next day to start building. The one on Parklands Drive that I referred to was approved well over a year ago. They had some issues which weren't really pertinent. They have to push out the existing tenants. These things take time. It's been well over a year. They haven't started the demolition, which means it takes, in New Canaan, it takes at least a year to build a single-family house. So you can imagine how long it's going to take to build a 56-unit apartment building. And thus, we will wait to get whatever points we get from that. Another year, maybe another 2 years. And that's unfortunate that we're doing our best, but beyond our control.
So we have almost 26,000 housing units in Greenwich. Inclusionary zoning went in like 1987. And we've had the ADUs for about as long with, tweaking them over time. We have a walloping 31 units built under the inclusionary in all those years. And we have 10 ADUs.
Wow.
Since 1987.
Mm. And our ADUs are wide open, they're as of right, but the cost is prohibitive for people.
That's what.
Ovani, the chair of Darien, used to say, well, they're just gonna convert the pool houses, but they're not even doing that. Or maybe they are, and they're just not telling us. Okay, they're not telling us. That's another thing on the ADUs. It could be that they are doing cooking facilities in pool houses now with bedrooms and et cetera. But people who formally are filing an application to do an ADU, there you have it. We're just not seeing them.
How many
So-
housing units does Darien have?
Housing units, we have about 7,000 housing units, plus or minus.
Okay, so we're more on, I mean, we're nowhere on par with
Right.
Darien, with Greenwich, but
We've had more luck with the inclusionary units because, as I said, we have a lot of projects going in. So we've done pretty well with inclusionary units. I don't know the number off the top of my head, but as these projects get built out near the train stations, 14% of a 100-unit development is 14 deed-restricted affordable units that will get moratorium
And
points.
do you have any, because this is something I've thought about with our inclusionary zoning regulations, does each developer manage their affordable units separately? So there's no sort of clearinghouse for, I
It is a
want to
very
move to Darien and I want an affordable
It's a
unit.
very common
We
question.
have a clearinghouse, yeah.
Yeah, we've talked about it, and it's very awkward to tell someone, look, we have
Go there,
7
go
different
there, go
projects.
there, yeah.
Well, you
Yeah.
need to call each of the 7 people, whether it's Avalon, Federal Realty, John Smith, John Doe. They each manage their own projects. They each manage their own waiting lists. The Housing Authority has such demand, they've closed the waiting list. Once you're in a Housing Authority project, it's rare that you would move out because
Right.
you have a brand new unit in Darien. They're pretty new units. They're great. And they're well located. Why would you move
So
out?
same.
Yeah, so-
Our 830Gs and our inclusionary type zoning are all managed by a person that we share with Westport Poacher. Danielle, she's just, anyway. So we share, and that she does the same thing in Westport. So that's the kind of thing that you have. You have one person, she does the lottery just for those units. The Housing Authority has its own list, which is of course closed, same as yours. And then we have this person and she makes sure that the rents are reasonable, that they're not charging
Paperwork's
too much
done.
for, this is a big problem. Do you remember the bill that they tried to pass on the fees? There's a reason for that. I can't remember if that bill passed, but so what a lot of times in the affordable units, what you have to be really careful of, it seems picky, but all of a sudden they're charging for cable, for garbage removal, for the garage space. It goes on, and the rent becomes sky high. And people can't afford it anymore, and it's a way of being exclusionary. So she makes sure that that's not happening. And we had to go to the state at one point and get clarification because developers will find that as a way of recovering their investment. I mean, they're there to put food on their table, so. But yes, that's a problem. You have to track that. And as we get more and more of these 830Gs, how are you going to do that? Because you have to track every single one of them and make sure that they're being handled correctly. It's a huge, I don't know what the big places do, if anybody has, but we may be seeing more volume right now. Because the towns that have more than 10% affordable don't have to worry about it.
Any last questions? Maria?
So I read an article about Darien, how it had updated its ADU policy, especially in like a downtown area or something near, it was closer to the water. I think I read about that there were, because of the roads, there were certain restrictions.
Right.
Could you just talk about that a little bit?
Sure.
to
The
just
Planning and Zoning
explain?
Commission, back in, I'll call it the mid-1980s, talked about ADUs back then, but there were a lot of concerns and issues. And now currently, these days, it's a lot more amenable to people. But Planning and Zoning had a couple big concerns. One is on-street parking, that if you're building units, especially in a higher density neighborhood, that in towns in New England, in the winter, you can't park on the street. Right? They want to plow the streets. And we don't want cars overrunning the neighborhoods. So the example that was used, if you've ever been down to the Cove in Stamford, it's very high density and there's not a lot of off-street parking. So a lot of people park in the street. It becomes very tricky to get through the streets. And the commission said, no, no, no. If we're going to allow ADUs, we're going to make sure that they have sufficient off-street parking. I had a woman come in today. I said, ma'am, it doesn't take effect for a month and a half. Just relax. She said, but I need to know if my driveway will work, because the commission also said, which is the way it works in Darien, the off-street parking needs to meet the front yard setback and the side yard setback. So we're going to be, staff is going to have to look at people's driveways and say, well, is it enough to comply with the regulations such that cars are not parking in the street, jamming up the streets, clogging up the neighborhoods? The commission also put a maximum size ADU because they were worried that, you know, we just had someone build a 2,000 square foot, 2-story pool house in Darien.
Okay.
So they said, no, the maximum size of an ADU is whatever. And so they had to put some parameters. The biggest one in Darien was parking. We'll see if it works. I think we'll see how many people get upset that they have everything else to make it work in terms of size of the lot, size of the unit, enough building coverage. But parking is likely to trip a lot of people up. They were very concerned about the neighborhoods.
That's funny because we allow, if it's inside the existing structure, you can go to 1,300 square feet for your ADU, for your apartment. But if it's not, and you're adding a structure outside, it's only 500 square feet. Because we didn't want to, we had a lot of resistance to doing them as of right. So, but I kept saying, hey, if you have a 10,000 square foot house, I mean, your mother-in-law should have a nice place.
So we'll see. Obviously it doesn't take effect for a while. We'll kind of see how things shake out. Steve Ovani, the chairman, has said, look, it's likely in a couple of years. In fact, they very specifically wrote it in the regulation that it sunsets in 5 years, which gets them in 3 or 4 years to say, okay, what are we going to do? Are we going to tweak it? Are we going to throw it out the window? Are we going to run with it and readopt it as is? So it gives them a few years to see how it all works.
So one thing, just jumping, one more thing we didn't talk about, and I haven't gone back, and we kind of figured 5474 was going to pass and it was going to be okay, the bill that passed, and it's kind of a catch-all. It has a provision in it, Jeremy, if you create a zone, you can have middle housing that counts towards 830G. And I wrote you guys and asked if anybody thought that was worth it, if we wanted to create, and middle housing is basically, as I'm reading it, quads, 4-unit buildings, duplexes, that kind of, is that something any of us would want to consider enabling? Because then you get 830G points, important for you all.
It's a quarter hue point.
No, that was my
Quarter.
question.
It's something, and of
Mhm.
course, how many are you going to really do and how many points are you going to get for it?
Is it a quarter, 830G, is it a quarter point per unit?
Yeah.
So if you had a 4 unit, if you had a 4
Yeah.
unit.
So you get a whole point. I don't know if that's worth it. I was asking them because initially when I read it, I didn't think anybody was going to be very excited about it. But again, exploring, leave no stone unturned in what you can do that your town finds is consistent with why they moved, why your residents moved here to begin with. That's the big thing. Why do people move to our towns? You've heard that a million times.
Guys, thank you very much.
Thank you.
As you reflect on the conversation, feel free to shoot us any ideas. Okay. but
Oh,
much
you too.
appreciated.
I mean, say, hey, you guys you didn't think of this and this. Make suggestions for us. I'd love to know if you talk to other housing authorities. Have you ever done
Okay.
that?
No, well, housing authorities are really a creature of the state. They're not
But-
really town, right?
When I talked to the commissioner, she said that there are lots of housing authorities that work cross-border.
Because that was one of the
Interesting,
the
right?
proposals, the bills this year was to make that very,
But that was tricky because you didn't have to invite them in. You want to invite them.
Okay.
Okay, we're going to leave now. We're going to let you guys do other
I'll
stuff.
defer
I'll
my
talk
time
about
to
it.
Glenn Schaller. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Glenn, are you here?
Okay. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Item number 5, Affordable Housing Community Process Remarks and Discussion regarding the process with Glenn Chowder, President, Planometrics. Glenn, are you out there? Do we have him, Bob?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Glenn. How are you?
Wonderful. It's nice to see you again. Nice to be here tonight. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is sort of basic background. I'm Glenn Chalder from Planometrics. Planometrics has prepared 2 POCDs for New Canaan. We rewrote the zoning regulations in 2007. We created the incentive housing study. We actually wrote the inclusionary zoning regulation for you guys as part of that process. So there's a lot of things about town I know and love. So I'm delighted to have a chance to come back here tonight and share some information with you. So I think, Bob, do you have the PowerPoint queued up?
Yes.
Now would be the time.
He's getting there.
Yep. And I realize the screen is across the room for the members of the committee. So I think I've shared it with the town so the town can sort of share this with you later. If you have any questions or anything else along the way, I'll try to describe what it is that you're seeing on the screen.
Try to do it again.
You want me to share, Bob? All right. There we
There we
go.
go, Glenn.
Now, hang on a second here. That's not the one I wanted. So let me stop out of that. Oh,
Looks right.
that's Bob. Well, I thought, okay, yeah, that's great. So I'm here tonight because I wanted to talk with you and share some information about what I call housing conversations. I've had a chance to work with a number of towns in Connecticut on their affordable housing plans, plans of conservation and development, and other things. And I think having housing conversations has been very effective in terms of making progress with these municipalities. So next slide, please, Bob. I think my goal here tonight is to provide you some examples of ways that other communities have had housing conversations and tried to move the conversation along to make progress. My goal here is to help the committee and help New Canaan. Next slide, please. I use the word conversation intentionally because I think a conversation is something that people are generally more receptive to. And when we explain that a conversation involves, people talking together, it's a give and take about topics of mutual interest, and housing is certainly one of those. And I think it's a learning opportunity for all parties involved. I think for residents of New Canaan, it's an opportunity to kind of wrap their heads around this affordable housing issue. And I think for the committee and for planning and zoning in the town, it's also an opportunity to start thinking about principles that could guide us forward. And I think if artfully crafted, it can be the optimal form of communication. So I think as part of your efforts, if you're able to sponsor conversations in the community, that would be an excellent way to proceed. Next slide, please, Bob. I think one of the challenges we have with housing conversations is that most people who have housing don't always understand why other people do not. And so they start off from the perspective of some level of concern or a threat to their community. And I think as Melissa spoke earlier, she really talked about this fact, it's not a zero-sum game, that housing can actually make communities better and strengthen them. And my experience over the years has shown that there's a wide variety of people that can benefit from housing. And when people who are not as informed about housing issues generally start to adopt a negative perception until somebody close to them is affected by the lack of housing, and then they start to understand better. And I think that's a challenge for the committee as a whole, is how to make people understand that people that we would want in our communities, and I think the examples shared earlier in terms of, Melissa's going to go pick up her, Dunkin' Donuts coffee on their way back to New York. But the issue is, what if there was not somebody at Dunkin' Donuts to provide that service, or somebody at a restaurant, or a healthcare worker, or other things like that, or somebody to plow the streets? And these are, I think, some of the challenges we have. So helping people understand why housing is important for a complete community is an important next step. Next slide, please, Bob. So very often the challenges we have when we start talking about housing is that people think that the red box here in this graphic represents an actual project which is being proposed now. And people immediately jump up in opposition. They're concerned. It becomes conspiracy theories. It becomes all of this other stuff. And it's a challenging way to try to have a conversation. And I guess one of the things I found over the years that if we can back people up and talk about hypothetical situations that could occur in the future and start the conversations there, we can wind our way through this type of graphic so that we could actually get to a situation we're talking about an actual project now that people would understand its genesis and more likely to support it. So I think, again, starting off conversations with hypotheticals, may come to fruition sometime in the future is a good way to start. Next slide, please. A couple of things I just wanted to share with you. We heard some information here tonight about the lack of housing. This is data from the Federal Reserve. And it shows the production of housing in America from 1959 through to 2020. What we find after the housing crisis in 2006, we had this huge gap where banks weren't lending for housing construction, developers weren't risking their money to create this situation. And even though interest rates were low, housing wasn't getting produced. We created this big gap, or it wasn't created, I guess it happened. But there were 12 million housing units in America that didn't get built that normally would have gotten built. So the reason we have an affordability crisis, it certainly started back in the 1980s, but it really ramped up after the financial crisis in 2006. In the simple law of supply and demand, people understand if there's a shortage of supply, then demand is going to drive prices higher, and that's really what happened. Next slide, please. And this chart shows the challenge of what I call housing unaffordability. You've probably heard the ratio that a family or a household shouldn't spend more than 30% of their income on housing. And so if we look back over time to the late 60s and we compare the median price of housing in the United States with median incomes, we see that the ratio, which is what this orange line is, was below the affordability benchmark of 30%. For a long time until the baby boom generation got to house buying age and there wasn't enough supply for that demand. It started to float along at the affordability threshold. And then again, as part of the subprime mortgage crisis and then the big gap, housing prices relative to income have just gone kaflooey. So there are many people who have benefited from having bought housing 40 or 50 years ago, that if they actually were in a situation that they had to buy a house today and didn't have equity to tap, they'd have a serious issue or problem. So I think some of these things you might want to think about sharing with the community about why housing's become an issue. It's not a social issue. It's really an economic issue, and its roots go back many decades. Next slide, please. We put New Canaan into the context of the state as a whole. There's 169 municipalities. 28 of them have more than 10% of their housing stock meeting the affordability threshold. So they're exempt from 830G. That means there's 141 communities that are non-exempt. But if we look at the median percent of housing stock that meets 830G and the mean, we can see where New Canaan falls in this. It's ranked number 88 out of 169 municipalities in Connecticut. So it's near the median. But again, it's behind what a lot of other communities have done. Next slide, please. This slide shows the percent of affordable housing relative to the housing count in the community. So you can see there's a little bit of a slope from bottom left to top right. And so bigger communities would have perhaps more opportunities for having affordable housing. Next slide, please. If we focus in on communities around New Canaan size, what we see is communities with about 7,500 housing units. There are communities that do have more affordable units than New Canaan does. And some of these could provide examples for New Canaan to consider in terms of similar communities and what they've done. And I do agree there's socioeconomic differences as well, but this might be useful and helpful for the community. Next slide, please. So conversations help people better understand housing issues and provide useful guidance. And I want to share with you some examples of activities I've been involved with in other communities. Next slide, please. So Fairfield is a community which is in Fairfield County. Next slide, please. Fairfield's kind of unique because their first affordable housing plan was created in 1988. And the woman who was the first selectman at the time recognized that housing and housing affordability was becoming a significant issue in Fairfield. And so I believe they had the first affordable housing commission or committee created in the state at that time. And I had a chance to work with them on their 2014 and 2021 affordable housing plans. And this is the cover from the 2014 affordable housing plan. And I put it on the screen because I think, based on my analysis of your work to date, these concepts of diversifying New Canaan's housing portfolio and taking control of your future is something that I think the committee has talked about and thought about. And so there might be some gems that you could find in some other communities' plans as well. Next slide, please. But one of the activities we did back in 2014 is we had public meetings where we asked people to come in. And because people generally come with a sense of trepidation about housing, we started off with an exercise. And we asked people to put dots on these grids or graphics. And we said, okay, in your life at different ages, what type of housing did you live in at that time? And then a follow-up was that, where do you think you're going to live in the future? What type of housing? And through this exercise, we were able to share with people that they had a very diverse background of housing compared to where they live today. And in the future, they actually wanted more variety in their housing stock than what the community had. We also asked the question about, how do you feel about Fairfield's housing mix? Do you have, three bears, too much, too little, or just about right? And there were certain situations where people felt, you know what, perhaps we do have too little of this, or maybe we do have too much of that. And to try to explore what people are thinking or feeling in the community. So these exercises were helpful, I think, to open people's eyes up to the fact that there is a whole world of housing out there. And in many times, people have lived in these different types of housings during their life. And they're not bad people. They're not people to be afraid or concerned about. And maybe New Canaan could do a similar thing. Next slide, please. I think working group, getting people into small groups to talk around a table about their ideas are useful and helpful. We use those, I think, to some effect in Fairfield. Next slide, please. What we had done is create a sort of a scorecard, I guess I'll call it. And in these different areas, we asked people, what housing strategies do they think that Fairfield could consider? And on the left-hand side of this chart was sort of more passive strategies, right? This wasn't really anything that the town might really get aggressively involved in. And then as you move further over to the boxes on the right, these were sort of more active strategies, the town real involvement. And maybe it's financially assisting housing units from the town, not waiting for state money or something else, but, what could we do? And then people in the room were given dots, green dots for things they really thought they could do, and orange dots or red dots for things they weren't too excited about. And you could start to see some areas where people were actually being a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more amenable to ideas. And so it wasn't just like a binary choice, do this, take it or leave it. It was people in groups working together to decide areas where they could work, and they learned from each other. And within the same group, people could have been all the way over on the left, or people could have been all the way over on the right, but they're all better informed and educated. So this is an activity or exercise that you might want to consider to kind of stretch boundaries. Next slide, please. Wow. There you go, thanks. So the next one is Kent. So Kent, Western Connecticut, Northwest Connecticut, a couple of private schools locally or whatever, have had a long history of affordable housing promotion. I had a chance, next slide, please, Bob. I had a chance to work with them as part of the incentive housing zone study. And this is, again, I did some work with New Canaan on its incentive housing zone study, but Kent was a little interesting. There was a parcel next to Kent Village, and it hadn't been developed, and they thought it was a wonderful opportunity to develop. And the question was what and how. Next slide, please. So a number of different sketches were put together to sort of explain different ways that the property could develop. I've just shared with you just a couple of the sketches here. One was a 27 lot subdivision, and the yellow lots were going to be affordable. Drainage was actually an issue here. This property was going to help solve a drainage issue in this property in the town center area. The railroad track was built here many, many years ago, and it bottled up water, and it needed a place to go. There was a 25 lot subdivision configured a little bit differently. And then there was a 46 unit development. Next slide, please. So we used this with people to get comments and feedback. And then we started to use little 3-dimensional models. Now these are simply made with foam and a foam knife, I guess you'll call it, or a little foam saw. And they're not meant to be absolutely perfect and intricate. But you can see over here in the background, we have these blue buildings, which were the existing development around it, the density. And so we helped people understand that even though the railroad tracks, you really couldn't see what was going to happen in the meadow, in this particular scheme, it was roughly the same density and configuration as already existed. So people started to understand better. And valuable lessons were learned from that. And compared to this other sketch, which I think those units, those were I think those were perhaps 6 unit buildings, just to compare. So tactile exhibits are really helpful for people. If you give them these modules to play with, they actually really get into it. And that might be something, again, to think about as part of your effort for the future. Next slide, please. So the next one is Salisbury. I think Salisbury, in a lot of ways, this is the most northwest community in Connecticut. I think it's a bit of a success story for a community of its size. I think if Melissa was still around in the room, she'd tell you that Jocelyn Eyre from, I guess that's the Litchfield County Committee on Housing Opportunity. I'm not quite sure. Lived in Salisbury, has been very active with them. Next slide, please. Oh, the other way, Bob. There you go. Thank you. So in a small town like Salisbury, they came up with a plan that they felt that they needed to produce 75 units over, I think it was a 5-year period. And the question was, how and where could that be accomplished? How are we going to explore this? And the issue came up, what would the residents prefer? So I had a chance to work with them on some public meetings where we open meeting session type explored different topics, but I thought there was one which was very effective. Thanks, Bob. Yes, next slide, please. So they decided to have a big community meeting. They chose to do it on a weekend during the day. They had 90 people in attendance in Salisbury, which is pretty good turnout. The expressed goals for the meeting were to learn more about Salisbury's housing needs, figure out how we might address them, explore where and how they could be addressed, but also, and I think this is key perhaps for the committee to consider, to extract principles that the town could use going forward to identify places, locations, or ways that they would prefer things. So it's a matrix or a grid of things that we might want to try to accomplish. Now, on the slides that are going to follow, when residents or attendees arrived at the meeting, they got colored dots, and they got green dots, a certain number of green dots for things that they favored, a certain number of red dots for things they really weren't too excited about. And I think the other color was blue for things they thought they needed more information on. There were 7 different sites that they had identified in the community. And as you can see, some of the sites had different options on them. And people got a chance to wander around the meeting and explore and ask questions and everything else. And then they had a chance to go ahead and vote. So the next slide. Shows what happened with regard to the Salmon Kill site. Now, this was a 34 home sort of little cottage community, or, you know, single family type of situation, or maybe I'm looking now, maybe those were duplexes, little pods here, 33 homes, 64 homes in a more condo type of arrangement, and then 46 again in a cluster. And as you can see here, the people were putting dots on like, wow, we could get 34 homes in this one and the configuration works for us. Whereas over here in the top right, this one, for whatever reason, was 2 to 1 against. 27 people said, I'm not too wild about this. Same site, but different configurations of units. And people just felt what they knew about the site or whatever, that these would be useful. Next slide, please. Oh. Yeah, next one, please. There you go. Thank you. So these were much smaller sites in and near the center of town. And this was a scenario here that they could put 2 homes on a small lot or 4 homes. And what they did here is they used these little drawings, which are known in architectural circles as axonometric drawings. They're fairly simple drawings to create, but a blob on the map, a rectangle or something, for people who read maps on a regular basis, they see the blob, but they don't really kind of get what's going on. But an architect or somebody with some graphic skills can create a little axonometric drawing, which is much more user-friendly, and get people to say, oh, I get it now. I see how that could work, and put it into context of the neighborhood. And perhaps, again, that might make a difference. And you can see, again, some of the responses here. So I think these types of activities where people get a chance to visualize and understand can be helpful. Next slide, please. So this was more of a sort of a downtown villagey block, where they were proposing to do a building which would have, I think it was 12 or 15 units in it. And again, given its setting and location, if memory serves correctly, I think the first floor was going to be storefronts and retail, and then the upper floors are going to be residential. And they felt this was something that was going to reinforce and strengthen their village. So again, a different sketch, different location, different parameters, but useful feedback from the community. Next slide, please. Yeah, and this was a much more rural situation here that had a wetland pond on it, et cetera. But the question was, how could we, create, again, a little enclave, if you will. And this one, 28 homes, got pretty strong responses in terms of people in favor of it, not too many people opposed. So again, very useful and helpful here. Next slide, please. I had the chance to do some work for the town of East Hampton on their incentive housing zone study as well. And they wanted to explore design guidelines as part of their work. So next slide, please, Bob. So we did what's probably best called a visual preference survey. And we said, well, listen, I mean, with what Margarita was talking about earlier, there were this missing middle housing concept. But in terms of development, there could be single family developments or duplexes or townhouses or other things. And we took pictures of different types of developments or housing units locally and in other places, and asked the members of the commission to indicate which of these they had the most positive feelings toward, bless you, and the least positive feelings toward. And then we created these guidelines here, which ended up in their regulations. And the regulations said favorable design treatments, gave examples and highlighted some of the things that the commission members had identified as being important design attributes. And then unfavorable design treatment, sort of a flat facade, no shingles, this really didn't seem to do much for the community. And East Hampton, again, it's got a village with a nice architectural flavor to it. And we shared the same examples here for duplex or townhouse type buildings. And again, unfavorable design treatments. Next slide, please. And then at the bottom, we also had information here again of which elements are encouraged or required and which elements are discouraged. And these might provide some of the principles, et cetera, that the commission was looking for or could be looking for in the future. And I think people might understand better that, you know, if you can't tell what's in the building's attractive and fits in, then it might be something that would work well for the community. I think this is close to my last slide, but I just wanted to point out here on the right-hand side of this slide. Oh, sorry, Bob, not yet. Yep, go back up. This text here is from Public Act 2129, and some of you may or may not be familiar with this, but it was the major public act passed in the 2021 legislative session related to housing. And Section 13 of that act called for the creation of the Commission on Connecticut's Development and Future. And one of the things that they were supposed to do was prepare model design guidelines for buildings that municipalities could adopt in whole or in part of their regulations, including common building types, particularly those associated with housing. So I don't know where that's at this point in time, but I just throw that out there because it's possible that you may find some examples in the state's own work product, the legislature's own work product that they commission that might provide design guidelines that could be useful and helpful to you in New Canaan. So just pass that along. So I think the next one is the last slide, if you would, Bob. So thank you for the opportunity to be here tonight. Encourage you to have conversations with people to help better understand housing issues. And I hope some of these tools or techniques might be useful or helpful to you going forward. So with that, any questions?
Questions for Glenn?
Glenn, hi, I have a question. This is Jane. I'm wondering if some of these techniques are more appropriate at a different point in time in a process than others. Whether you could speak to that a little bit. I was looking, for example, at what you did with Fairfield, the hypotheticals. Is that more appropriate when a long-term plan is being developed versus housing decisions are going to be made in a short time horizon? Are different kinds of conversations more effective at different points along the way?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good example. I think that is the case. I think it all depends on how the conversation that you would like to have with the community unfolds. There's always a little bit of trepidation, I think, for a committee or a commission when you're deciding on policies or guidelines. And I think in New Fairfield's case, particularly in terms of the group discussion, that I would say occurred roughly 2/3 of the way through the process because they felt they needed that level of feedback on what they were doing and thinking. I think the other projects were definitely site oriented And the only way that they were going to get sort of meaningful feedback was to share the diagrams, et cetera. So I think it really depends on what the commission wants to learn at any particular point in time.
Okay, thank you.
Well, Glenn, sort of a little bit in backing up. So how do you think about the process that preceded the community review, specifically site identification? I mean, how did you work with towns on that process?
Well, I think if you go back to I know your current POCD is in its final stages. I think the 2014 POCD had some locational guidelines in it, John, in terms of housing, to think of locations that might be better than others. I think, as Margarita also mentioned in her comments, there are places probably in New Canaan that would be more supportive of housing diversity than others. I mean, North New Canaan, 4-acre zones, really far away from transit and other things. There's land, but it's perhaps not well located to address the need for housing in ways that people of modest incomes, to have a good place to live. So I think my sense would be that you might think about identifying, call them policy areas or something, that different locational attributes. And then if you could explore with New Canaan residents, even a hypothetical site. So whether it's down next to Talmadge Hill, or it's closer to the town center, or down, I think it's 123 towards Norwalk, are there sites around or neighborhoods or locations, but it's not an actual piece of property. It's a hypothetical piece of property. And what could we do here with different concepts, and see what sort of feedback you get from people about things that they would find more supportive than others. I think with housing, people often just want to say no. But I think if there were ways to get people to say, I mean, in Salisbury, 75 units in Salisbury was not a task for the faint-hearted. And they really got feedback from people that, okay, look, if we're going to produce or try to produce 75 houses, this type of approach and this type of location is better than others. And I think that could help the committee move forward. And you may move faster than that, John. I think that's well and good. I think I'm just an advocate here tonight for having conversations in ways that really try to involve residents early in the process and giving meaningful guidance other than just saying no.
Anybody else?
I think this is really helpful. I would
Yep.
love to have a copy of this presentation if that's possible.
Oh, yeah, it's on Bob, it'll be
All
on
the
the town
presentations from
website
tonight.
and, pardon me?
It'd be great to have all of them from.
Oh, yeah.
today. Yeah.
Actually, I do have one comment, though.
Sure.
So when you were talking about A30G and the percentages, it's something that I harp on a lot, because there are certain towns like New Canaan, because we have different demographics. We don't have farmland, so we can't qualify for that. We have higher property values again, so we don't have CHAFA loans like other towns might. And some of the ones you mentioned have significantly more CHAFA loans, so that helps their percentages. So part of the challenge for us is that we always have to focus on that column 1. So it's really
What's
it's
column 1?
column 1 of your 830G, where you say we have 3.9%.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you.
That all comes from column 1, which means government and state assisted, federal and state assisted housing development. And that's essentially 100% of what we do, because all of our, whatever we've had through set asides have expired. And we really have 31 vouchers. So it makes it very challenging. And I think everybody should understand that those towns that have 10% have had 10%. And the ones that have 10%, it was 31 and now it's down to 29. And it's probably going to keep decreasing as units start expiring for a lot of these larger cities. So I think while interesting, it doesn't really tell the whole story and the challenges that some towns face in creating affordable when, it's just a certain a way of accounting it. That's just been very arbitrary.
Well, I think, but New Canaan's got opportunities that other towns don't have. We wrote the incentive housing policy many years ago to give New Canaan funding opportunities, which I think what I've seen over the years is the housing authority, the money was used to help the housing authority pre-design Canaan Parish and the expansion of the housing authority project, which got those units built, and you doubled the number of units in town. That money didn't, wasn't given to you or anything else. The taxpayers didn't front the design money. The incentive housing payment created a funding source, which got New Canaan onto the process. So I think there are access to funding resources locally that can assist this effort, and that's something that an opportunity that other towns don't have either. So it's a double-edged sword, I think. There's challenges, opportunities, et cetera. It's hard for everybody.
Anybody else? Okay. Glenn, thank you very much.
John, one last thing. I think the slides I sent through were 2 on a page. I'll send to you 1 slide per page, because I think at that point in time, they'll be bigger and might be more useful for people. So thank you for the opportunity. Best wishes on your journey.
Thank you.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you, Glenn.
These are all posted to we have a website, don't we? Sorry?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I don't think they're up there yet.
Yeah, but they're available.
As
Okay.
long as they're available.
Yeah.
In due course.
Sure.
Yes. Perfect. Thanks, Bob.
Okay, item 6, Project Development Subcommittee update and discussion with the committee. Krista.
So we had a meeting on April 29th. Say that as a question, but that's the date on the agenda. And we covered a couple different things. We had a short presentation from Rick Ross of Westmount Property Management, who manages the Canaan Parish and Millport, the administration of those units. And we wanted more feedback specifically on the demand for the different types of units in each of those projects. And so that was helpful. Then we had a conversation about sort of best case, worst case scenarios for our Hue Point calculations, which are now filling in a little bit in terms of knowing where we stand on this. So yeah, I mean, there were 3 pieces of the puzzle that were sort of outstanding at that time. The first is getting our moratorium approved on May 22nd of this month. And so we don't have that answer yet, but hopefully by the June meeting we will. The second was the lawsuit against the Department of Housing, which I'll come back to that because that piece is probably answered. And then the third piece is the 830G lawsuits. So in terms of the high, low, sort of like best case, worst case scenario situations, if we take as fact at this moment that our lawsuit against the Department of Housing is moot, as we heard Tom O'Day suggest this evening. If we were to win, well, let's also assume that we get our moratorium on May 22nd. If we were to win the 830G lawsuits, meaning none of those units as proposed get built, the town would only need to build 15 Hue Points, which is probably 7 to 10 units. For a moratorium following this moratorium. So that would be in 2028. We'd have to have 7 to 10 units, 15 Hue Points built. If we lose the 830G lawsuits, we'll have a surplus of units, meaning not only do we get back the 81 units for Canaan Parish and Millport, we'd also have all of these units built at Weed and Elm and the other places that have been proposed. So we wouldn't even have, the town would not have to construct anything in that scenario to be able to make a moratorium. So that's a little update on that. And then the third piece that we talked about in the meeting was we've had some mapping done to start to identify town-owned, state-owned properties, as well as properties over 5 acres that are in private ownership. And we're going to go through that with a fine-tooth comb and start to think about which ones may be good options and what the reasoning behind that is so that we can start to also kind of simultaneously formulate evaluation criteria that we're using to look at properties that come before us in terms of what might work or what might not work. Again, with this change in the number of units that we'll need, obviously, we may need to rethink our strategy in terms of the types of property we're looking for, because only needing to construct 7 to 10 units is a very different project than looking to build 70 to 100 units. So that being said, I think it's still a useful process, even if we identify sites that at this point in time could take more units than we need to build. I think it's kind of good to have a short list of places that you might want to go back to in the future, because as I think both Margarita and Jeremy pointed out tonight, the further down you go, the moratorium rabbit hole, the harder it is to find places to build. So I think doing the hard work now, even if we don't take advantage of it, is still a useful exercise.
Particularly if the governor signs the law and those units carry over sort of
Right,
indefinitely,
right.
then if we, I'm not saying we would maximize any lot that we might use, but maybe we don't just build
Right.
15,
7
but
to
we
10.
build 30 and it's still, you know, fits within the, where it is. So I think that's super helpful.
I would agree. I would agree, because I mean, I think whenever you think about any lot, it's how can you cut the cost per unit? How can you maximize your development in a smart way?
Right.
And so, of course, that's the smart way to do it.
Mhm.
So, yeah. And the only other thing to consider is what about other development that's occurring in our town? Because that's also going to go against us, right? Like just
Oh, you
market
mean-
value development.
Right.
So there could be some flux in that number as well from that.
Well, it doesn't go against us until the census comes out, right? We'll have a new census, which will,
2030.
the 2020 census will establish the number of units, which I think is still an open question.
Yeah.
But
Yes.
it's 2030 that
Oh,
you
that's
have to worry
true.
about a new
Okay.
census.
That's a great point.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this in our POCD subcommittee, which is a whole different planning and zoning thing, but the numbers I've seen for 2020 aren't that massively different from 2010. And in fact, if anything, they were like slightly lower,
Mhm.
which cognitively doesn't make any sense. So we're working through why that could be.
Krista, could I ask you to repeat what you said? It sounded like it was important and I couldn't hear you.
Oh, I was saying that we've seen at our Plan of Conservation Development Subcommittee of the Planning and Zoning Commission, the 2020 census numbers on housing units, and they actually went down slightly from 2010, which doesn't make a lot of sense, and we don't have data to support why that would be the case. So anyway, my point is they haven't gone up yet, but yes, if we started to build a lot in this town, then we would have to revisit what 2% or 10% looks like.
Yeah, the number they have is 7,502 is the number of units we have, which is less than what it was
Yeah.
10 years ago. But it also, they did this during COVID,
Right,
so the numbers are not quite.
right.
They are.
They
are
are
what
what they
they
are. We'll
I
take
I
it.
don't really know how you argue that. I mean, it's
I
done
don't
by
even
the
know how you
Census
would
Bureau.
audit it.
No,
I
you
think it
wouldn't.
is what it is,
can't.
right?
I think it is what it is, and once it's finalized, we live with it.
Right.
But it's something to consider for 2030, that if
Right.
we see a jump, if that would kind of make sense. If we see a sort of, yeah, big jump, that would make sense. Okay.
What it brings up, though, is we can now consider a dramatic change in strategy. We know.
At least for the short-term issue of next moratorium, yes.
Well, yes and no, because I think, if we could think about a strategy where I call it small ball, but one of the things a lot of us talk about is not necessarily increasing density but still providing more affordable units. And so perhaps we look at what's in place. and where are the opportunities to increase affordable units. And, you know, if you put into place, and I don't have the numbers in my head, but if you can put into place a strategy where that sort of carries on, you know, and then you've got the benefit of time, because then we're up to 8 years. So if you can put into place a long-term strategy, you start to take care of that long-term objective. I think the other thing we can still look at, to your point, is, yeah, we do have significant properties in town, which can still be examined. Now, some people can say, well, guys, you're going to get away from your mandate. I don't think that's necessarily true, but we can still go ahead and look at, you know, more significant properties where it's things we've always talked about. And maybe it's, you know, talking about processes is having people come in and show renderings of what something could look like. And again, ultimately, we're not going to make the decisions, we're going to present it to the town. But there are properties that probably should be developed. So I think that's another strategy. So I mean, I think the beauty of this is it opens, it makes it more complicated. Because when you think about it, until a couple of days ago, we sort of knew we needed to achieve 700 units. We had to play big ball. You know, now it opens up a bunch of different strategies we could consider. So,
Yeah, it might make more sense, and we might be able to get more done in a shorter time frame if we took small bites, but then at the same time be developing something a bit larger for the
Right.
following moratorium, but not feel rushed and, or feel like we're gonna have a gap where we're again exposed.
Right.
Yeah.
That,
yeah, I agree.
yeah, so
And you
it
can,
flips the strategy kind of on
Mhm.
its head of what we were thinking of doing a big thing first, then maybe nibbling at the edges where
Right.
we need to. We could potentially flip the two
Yeah.
and actually then not have any gaps between moratorium application or moratorium.
The other gift it would be for us that we can look at what's really right for the town
Yes.
instead of feeling that we're under the gun of a time crunch that requires us to do something one way versus
And it might open
another.
up the possibility of doing like senior housing, which is, it doesn't have as many hue points,
Right.
but to the extent we're not sort of,
Mm.
like you said,
Yeah,
under the
true.
gun, that's a real need here that we could try to fulfill since we're not, we don't have to be so laser focused on
We
doing
don't have to go
100.
for the highest point grab.
Exactly, like we could be incredibly thoughtful about it, which I think is the benefit of this legislation. That's really, really good.
Absolutely.
But keeping in mind what our charge is under the ordinance, I think that this
Exactly.
is quite a bit. So, and what our charge is, it's defined in the ordinance now, and I think we frame, the issue gets framed a lot more closely now. The lens is sharpened now, if what we heard tonight holds. One more permutation, that would be, you know, what happens with the litigation, but regardless almost with the
which
litigation.
litigation? The 3830Gs or the DOH?
The D30Gs,
Yeah,
I'm sure the
30Gs,
DOH is resolved.
On the 30Gs, I think the point that the gentleman from Darien raised, it was, you know, even when these things are ready to go, it is a very tough time to start. There's never been a worse time for viability in residential. You know, costs are way up, rents are up, but not as much. Add in affordable units, that makes the viability even tougher. So I don't, you know, until we see things happening on the ground, I don't think we should be counting on any 830G related units to get us hue points.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, and the good news is we don't need them.
No,
At this
but,
point, if everything
but
we've
you don't
heard
want
tonight
to,
stands.
you don't want to muddle your math by saying, well, we've got this and we've got this maybe, and it just,
No, my point was a little different than, my point is regardless as to how the 830G litigation comes out, I think our focus now is much more limited on what we would need to satisfy the charge of the ordinance.
Does it just, I can't remember whether the ordinance is specific for just one moratorium or whether it's perpetual.
Perpetual.
moratorium. So I think that
It's
it's
perpetual.
it's a much narrower focus right now.
Right.
It's perpetual,
not
but
be.
as I helped draft the ordinance, Tom and I drafted it together, and I think that we did, the immediate need is to meet the moratorium, but the broader scope of it is to really identify sort of what I call the lowercase affordable housing needs too. That isn't necessarily specifically geared to 830G. So I think our immediate mandate, and the first selectman reiterated this, is to meet that moratorium, but I do think that the scope could be wider, assuming we meet it in a generous way too. That, you know, the more comfortable we are with that, the more we could explore.
Hillary, we have to do affordable housing reports as part of the ordinance. But my assumption is affordable housing in the ordinance is as defined by 830J. Is that correct?
We specifically, I have to look at it, but I think we didn't want to define it that specifically. I think we reference 830G as like a priority, but we wanted to keep the definition. And I think considering that's our mandate at the moment,
Yep.
that yes, that's what the reports should focus on. But if memory serves, we drafted the ordinance in such a way that, you know, later on down the road, it wasn't a hindrance to looking at other things. And if we, for instance, senior housing, it's just a fewer number of few points, but it still would satisfy the statute.
Yeah, it's pretty generic. Prepare an annual report on the committee's activities. The town bodies. I'm not looking in the right place.
I can't draft trusts, but you try to like draft these so that they're, you know, I think Tom and I tried to do that.
Yeah, you could play around with your wording.
I'd
I'm
argue
looking
that in
at the
court.
first
I'd argue that.
page.
I'd say it's broad enough. But again, it's what I think too, it was taking the input from town leadership and what they wanted us to accomplish as a priority. And I think
Yeah.
that's.
No, just to your point, I mean, your first sentence is, work town New Canaan, other town bodies to increase the number of affordable housing units in New Canaan and to maintain local control of housing development. And then you go on to say it's to achieve successive moratoria as well. So there is wiggle room if we wanted to.
Sure. I don't even know did we say 830G in it? Because I remember there was a
You did.
conversation about if that gets amended, or there's probably a clause in there like 830G as it exists or as amended, just in case it gets amended that we're still, or it goes away completely, which will never happen, but I don't think.
You're pretty specific in the first line of maybe
Okay.
later on, but the way this reads is, no, it's maintain successive moratoria under subsection I or L of section 830G.
Okay.
So,
Cross that bridge when we come to it.
I think to someone's point, maybe Jane said, I think that takes the pressure off a little bit. And again, to borrow John's phrasing, they can play a little more small ball. Now, there may be an opportunity for a big play. And if what holds up with the DOH lawsuit, then we can bank it further down the road. I think it takes the pressure off and gives us more opportunities now to maybe look at small ball, which is a good way to put it, to at least be ready for the next moratorium.
It also puts us in a situation regarding the big play to do it when the time is right? When the pieces all come into place, when the land is ready, when the funding's ready, as opposed to having to squish it.
Yeah, and maybe to what we heard tonight with Glenn and others, maybe there's a site that's identified and maybe start thinking about that and maybe getting people focused on it and maybe comfortable with it, but it's not done right now. It's
Right.
done years down the road.
Right. Yeah, and that could be a long process to get people comfortable with it.
Well, I think also the state land, the opportunity for state land, and that obviously we've heard takes time. So if there are any opportunities where we could maybe come up with some ideas for something like that.
That's a really good point. I mean,
Of current state land.
Current state land in New Canaan. And because
Parking lot or that strip right by the train station.
Yeah, I mean, that's the bigger point is anything that takes time, whether it's state land or any strategy that takes time is now potentially doable for us because we have time.
And that's a longer term strategy. And as we heard, I think when Scott Hobbs talked about it, that it's a 4 to 5 year, planning and everything process. So we're at the right place right now. And if this all works out with our points, then it's nice to take a look at maybe that report that Westcog is going to be coming out with soon, which I'm still waiting for, that talks about different strategies that towns can use in their toolbox to create maybe some smaller projects and different ways of creative ways of getting.
That conceivably could be quicker.
Yeah.
Is there an ETA to get that report out?
I think it's soon. I keep hearing soon. So I will follow up.
It's interesting. I keep asking this question, and you know, I've asked it tonight too. Is like a little frustrated that there isn't more detail on, sorry for my term, small ball strategies, but because it could end up becoming a key focus just to get those immediate units.
I think it'd be interesting to talk to some of the, I guess there's only 3, but land trusts and see how they make a go of it in some of these places, whether they're working in partnership with the municipal government, whether they're nonprofit sort of operating on their own, trying to both be a real estate player and a developer. Like, how are they doing that? Because in some places, that's a really big piece of the puzzle. And I think if we're going to get into the land banking business, having an experienced partner, or at least leaning on the experience of someone, is important.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of nonprofits out there that are doing exactly that.
Yeah. Yeah, and I
That's
mean,
what we need to
you
tap
know,
into is that expertise.
yeah. And one that's been successful, because a lot of them try it. And as we all know from sitting at this table for several months now, affordable housing is not a highly profitable business. So a lot of them don't end up making it. Like, they fizzle out because the finances just don't work out. So who's done it successfully and at any sort of scale? You know, I'm not talking 1 or 2 pieces of land. I'm talking over time, a lot more than that.
Okay, anything else, Krista?
No. Anyone on the committee?
When's our next meeting? It's,
June 3rd,
yes, okay, it's the week before.
which is the same night as
Yes.
the finance. So if we do have a conflict and people want to hear, who did you guys say was speaking? The affordable
So,
housing?
yeah, so we're gonna try and get Sam Fuller from Darien's Affordable Housing Trust. He grew up here, and Sally Bednar, whose husband grew up here, from the Greenwich Affordable Housing Trust, so.
You guys are meeting at 7? Didn't we agree we would meet at 6?
We're meeting at 6, but
Then if we could piggyback and come watch your stuff.
Yeah,
We should keep your meeting to an hour.
yeah, we'll see. I'll put the
we
agenda
could,
together and let you guys know.
I mean, we could move it to 7:30. What, you know, so we haven't met since our last meeting, and that's on me because I was traveling a lot, but we're gonna try and get our schedule set and get the rooms booked and the agendas out in time. So I'm committing to better execution going forward.
Okay, well, that was number 7. Number 8, speakers, any interest in future, any specific topics?
Well, I think we're at a little bit of a crossroads here. So in terms of speakers for our full group meeting, I think we ought to see what happens in the next week or so. And because I have a list, I think it would be really interesting to talk to housing authorities, but maybe not if we're not jumping into a big
Right.
project. But we've had a number of people recommended to us in that area. Be interesting to talk to local businesses in terms of need from their perspective. How do they see this? But again, I do think we ought to wait till we know a little more, which is we're going to know very soon, and see if, because we don't want to invite people that are not relevant to the conversation we're having 2 weeks from now. So again, please send along your input, because the suggestions have been very helpful. But that's my sense right now, John. We have a list of topics, but they're kind of the old picture. The new picture might be a little different.
What about Nick Belmonte? Because by the time we meet again, we'll have
Yeah, that's a
presumably a
great idea.
decision on our moratorium application. We have, hopefully, the governor will have signed the bill. And I think he can sort of walk us through that and the status of the 830G litigation, just to get whatever he can share.
Yep.
And to talk about, does that make our DOH lawsuit moot? Is the DOH going to challenge this statute? I mean, I think those are all things that we have to consider, because I don't want to look a gift horse in the mouth and
Right.
say, like, this is a done deal, because the
yeah.
DOH could go to court about this, and then we're stuck. So I think having him confirm or
Yeah.
manage our expectations with
Yeah.
respect to.
He's also, to that point, he's committed to get us communication as soon as he has a view.
Great.
So frankly, I'm hoping I'll be able to forward something to everybody sooner than that,
Great.
but.
That's a good idea, Hillary. I think that-
Yeah. I think that would be
And, you know, just the, maybe for everybody to think about, the other thing I'm thinking, and, well, the other thing I'm thinking about is, you know, this, frankly, this eye of small ball, if we think that's a direction we want to go into, if we can sort of find somebody who, exactly what you just said, whether it's the nonprofits or who exactly can say, okay, tactically, here's how you do it. If we could
Right.
find someone who, to your point, who's done it already in other communities, I think those could be the next best speakers. You know, let's get more operational here. You know, how do we take this to the next step? So that would be one idea I've had.
What about having, it's just an idea, someone like John Engel come in and talk about the market, like what is out there? Does he know of any landlords that have the sort of small buildings in it, like on River Street, that there were on River Street? I understand there's like a set of duplexes on in near South School too. And what a real estate agent would need us to have as a town to advocate, to come to us first, right? And that's money. But how much, if we were to ask the town for a set aside so that we could play small ball and acquire properties, what that process would be? Do we need to pass an ordinance to be able to do that? Can you do a special appropriation? I don't think you need to. I think under state statute, there's the open land fund, which we've established, and it can be for either open land or affordable housing. And once you've established that account, which we have, the Board of Finance is supposed to funnel money there, but there's no minimum, so they could do $1 a year. But maybe we add meat to that bone and say, look, if this is the strategy or a strategy we want to pursue, whether it's now or later, there might be a cause for asking the town to kick in a little bit to say, we have this fund where we can pounce on real estate opportunities before a developer might.
It's the town that does that, not us. We make a
No,
recommendation.
I know.
Yeah.
But it would be
Yeah,
helpful, we could recommend that
Yeah.
the town pony up some money and maybe, but it would be helpful to have an idea. Is it $1 million? Is it $5 million? Is it, you know,
Hey,
what?
John, you know, thinking about it, we've spoken with a number of people who are pretty clued into development in some of these communities, including the two folks that spoke to us tonight, you know, Marguerite and Jeremy. Perhaps we ought to go back to them and say, have you seen anybody who effectively played small ball? I mean, whatever words we want to use to describe it. And could you clue us into them? Because we'd like to know a little bit more about what it takes and how they go about it.
That's a good idea.
Related to that, I think, I don't know who the right person would be, but somebody who understands what you would need to do with these acquired properties in order to make them qualify
Yeah.
for 830G, because you want to make sure if you're buying and rehabbing properties that at the end result is something that actually gets EU points rather than just something that creates affordable housing.
Yeah.
Right. We have a guy. It's Art Cassavant.
Yeah.
Okay.
I've been talking to Art about this and I don't want to speak for Art, but directionally, it's my understanding, and we want Cassavant to confirm these conversations, that you can come in, you can purchase something, and particularly, for example, this isn't New Canaan, but there are examples where you come in and you purchase, say, a defunct factory, and you're going to make that into affordable housing. Now, I don't know why, you know, not a rundown, but a house, a home or whatever. And Mike, tell me if this directionally, you know, sounds right. You can come in, and as long as you present a plan to the state, to CHAFA, you can get the tax credits. You just have to come in, purchase it, rehab it. There's a certain amount investing. I think it's like 25,000 a unit or something like that. And as long as you can come in and say you're doing that, then you can apply for the necessary tax credits. I think that's the conversations Art and I.
4% one.
I
Before-
recall
yeah,
there
not the
being,
9 to 4.
On that last time, which was kind of
Yeah.
news to me, the housing authority hasn't done that but we learned that from Art last
Yeah,
time.
and I think the idea of having, maybe it's a couple of New Canaan realtors, so nobody's, upset. But somebody comes in and talks about, what's the opportunity set to do this type of strategy. I do think.
Right,
that
I'm
could be
sorry, it
interesting.
just completely escaped me. Marie, that obviously Maria's a realtor, so she
Yeah.
can, I'm sure she can tell us, because I know she knows the market. And the other question is, if they have renters that are in the duplexes or whatever, do we as a town want to buy something like that and then say, all right, you've got to go and we're going to renovate this and turn it into affordable housing, or do you?
Well, what you can do is you can also show a plan. Now that gets my understanding is it gets a little tougher because you have to show like a turnover plan. So, but I think you can say so you don't have to kick everybody. I don't think you have to kick out
Yeah.
everybody on day one.
Okay, good.
So.
Speaking of small, sorry,
Sorry.
go ahead.
Go ahead, James.
Are ADUs part of a small ball game, or are they not? Do they not end up? I
Doesn't
mean,
sound like it.
obviously, it sounded like it's very complicated for Greenwich and Darien.
So I think they are in the sense that if you're looking at affordable housing with a small a, yes, I think that there's a lot of upside to continuing to encourage and preserve ADUs in New Canaan to help people have another housing option. That getting them to give us credit towards a moratorium or towards the 10% is much more
You don't
challenging.
get points. And you don't get points even if it's deed restricted, because an individual at their home is not going to run the process
To open it up.
and
to
vet
private-
income and all the other things that needs to be done.
Okay.
Right?
So
Yeah,
I recall there being a restriction on the age of properties in 830G. I just want to make sure we don't, I think it was properties that had to be developed after 1980 or, there's a number in there, I recall. I
don't
just
think
want to
that
make sure we
it's-
don't fall
Yeah,
afoul of that.
no, we'll run down all those details. I think as long as you rebuild though.
Yeah, it's just
Well, I think
what
it's-
qualifies as rebuilding.
Yeah, and I think it's also things that existed before 1980 didn't get you Hugh points. It's like, that's like the cutoff date for when the Hugh point counting started. So like, we didn't
Okay.
get any Hugh points for Canaan Parish in 1970, whatever, when it was built, because it was before that
Yep.
cutoff date. But I don't think it means you can't buy housing of an age before
That's
that,
great.
I think.
I sort of remember back when, almost our first meeting, that there was some suggestion that we should be prepared for the state to continue to ramp up the requirements for housing. And so I'm just wondering about the small ball question. And if I understand the small ball question, if it's a series of houses, if there was one track or one place where we could solve, X times 10 or whatever it is, opposed to, a bunch of houses next to a bunch of people where you're having one battle on each house. And I'm just, I think for me, it's a little bit, I'm not saying I don't agree with the small ball or that approach. I'm just saying, I wonder, might we just be better off, really stepping out and doing the right thing, particularly if we do it the right way, given the time constraints, the building constraints, some thought around senior housing as well as affordable housing and a whole bunch of other things. So, but am I right that, wasn't there a question in the beginning that the state might very well?
Yeah, next
Ramp
year,
up.
they're gonna bring back their share. And that's probably gonna put us all at 20% number, not 10%. So it's not worth talking about right now.
So that's more of an issue, not for moratorium, but for achieving
Yeah.
10%. So for moratorium, I think the issue with the larger project is the time it takes to get the larger project done. And if we're delivering 60 or 70 units, that's great. But if we deliver it 5 years from now and we leave ourselves a year where we're exposed, that's not as good.
Right.
So it's both.
It's a parallel path.
Yeah.
Okay. Affordable Housing Committee Communication Strategy. Well, apparently I completely screwed it up since I got the wrong number. We no longer need 70 to 100. talking about my letter.
270 to 100. So I think you've prepared, you've laid
Yeah,
the
I
groundwork.
prepared,
And
yeah.
It's like over or under promising and over
Exactly.
Over delivering. Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly.
Guess what?
That's
We've
good
been
news.
so good.
Yeah.
That's what the
Committee's
housing
been so
authority thought
effective.
we had done a couple of years ago.
We
Was
won't bring up
over-delivering.
Tom's name.
For a surprise.
Okay, public comments. Anybody out there in Zoom land, Bob?
There's only two people left on the.
Okay, any hands
and no
raised of
hands
those two
up.
people?
No hands up.
Okay, great. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay. Hillary, Bill. Okay, everybody have a great night.
You can, if the council owns land, they want to put it out for any use, affordable housing or anything,